Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 128 of ThROH The Years, the podcast that reviews Ring of Honor show by show from the beginning. My name is Trevor Damed. I said Trevor Damed. I got my name wrong.
I'll be Damed. Well, I'll be Damed. We got a new host named Trevor Damed. I'm Matt Feuersteins, and this is ThROH The Year.
I feel like if you listen to the history of ThROH The Years, in terms of like my smoothness and professionalism, there's like a consistent line that goes up from the start of the podcast for like 15, 20 episodes, and then it just becomes a jagged line that looks like a mountaintop. Like it goes up and down every episode.
You know what, Trevor? Once you know that you got it, that just means that you don't have to flaunt it. You know, you could just be like, all right, I got this. I can just ease up now on the professionalism.
Finally, that's something I've always been accused of, having too much of professionalism. But we're back, Matt. We only have this is the fourth episode left in 2006, and it's crazy. Like this is one of the good things about this podcast is I don't have many things in my life that give me a sense of accomplishment, but I have to admit, like, as we're getting late in this 2006, like, I am going to have a weird sense of accomplishment when we finish 2006, because this is the longest we've ever been stuck in a year. I checked the other day, we've been covering 2006 for over 2 years on this podcast now.
I like that you say stuck in a year. I guess it does kind of feel that way with the late run of kind of mediocre shows that we've been reviewing. Not mediocre podcasts, because we've had wonderful guests that have made these podcasts must-listens. But, yes, mediocre Ring of Honor shows by their standards, we have to admit. So, I could see that being stuffed. And, yes, definitely, it does always feel like a milestone when we reach a new year in the podcast. And we're only a few episodes away from our extra-long year-end recap episode. Always an exciting time. Yeah. And also, we're at the era where we're starting to record in the warm weather months, and I have to turn any fans or air conditioners off. So we are in the era where I am disgustingly sweaty by the end of every episode. It feels like I did a workout. And,
same here. I had to close windows. I would have liked to have opened, but there's too much noise coming out from outside. So this is there might be no other wrestling podcast that gets sweatier for you, the people. So you better appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a badge of honor that we can wear. Matt F. Trophy goes to our sweat glands.
The spoiler for the end of the show. But in terms of, we always cover the news that between the last Ring of Honor show and this one, there's only one bit of news, but it's kind of a significant happening for Ring of Honor at this point in their history, because obviously Bryan Danielson missed the last two Ring of Honor shows and he's back. So what was he doing? He was in Pro Wrestling Noah. So we will go first to the the Wrestling Observer's Pro Wrestling Noah section. Dave Meltzer wrote, the final show of Noah's current tour was December 2nd at Yokohama Bunka Gym. Before an announced 3,800 fans, Kenta pinned Bryan Danielson in 25-21 of what we were told was a great match, using the Go to Sleep as the finisher. Because of their ROH match airing on Noah TV, every time the two faced off on the tour, the crowd saw it as something special. Danielson never wore the ROH title, nor was called the ROH champion, even though they used the ROH title match to build the feud. So that second part's kind of interesting. And based on that tidbit, I think I unearthed on a recent episode where I found some old thing Gabe had written on like MySpace or something, where he talked about how he wanted Bryan Danielson in 2006 to be like, to hype him up as like the double champion holding the FIP and ROH titles, together at both shows, but he would decide he didn't like bring the FIP title around. I wonder if this is as simple as Bryan Danielson did not want to bring the ROH title across the ocean to Japan with him on this tour and lug it around.
I mean, who would blame him for that, right?
Yeah.
It seems pretty annoying. But did you watch that Bryan Danielson versus Kenta match from that Noah tour?
No, I did not, unfortunately. I did not.
I did at the time. And I remember, at the time at least, thinking that it didn't hold up to the American matches that they had. But it'd be interesting to go and revisit it because, maybe my perceptions would have changed.
Yeah, especially because they have if we weren't a podcast that did things at a glacial pace and did things that all quick together, I mean, here's a free thing for another Review Cider podcast, like, watch basically the trilogy, because there's a third Kenta Danielson match in ROH in 2007. You could watch them all back to back to back quickly, and having them all quick in your head, you could have probably a very interesting take on how they differ, how they react, where meanwhile, when I do this show, like we just talked about the year-end show, every year-end show now is like Trevor Dame versus his rapidly fading memory. It's like, what shows happened this year? What matches? Let me look through my notes for 2 hours. What happened? So yeah, like trying to remember what I thought of a match from probably last time I watched it was a decade and a half ago. That's tricky, but
Bryan Danielson is still on his semi-retirement farewell tour. You never know. He might want another match with Kenta before it's all done. I don't know if the world is clamoring for that match right now, but it could happen, theoretically.
Kenta's so excited that Bryan Danielson was on the disciplinary committee that got rid of CM Punk, because that guy does not like CM Punk for taking his move. Like, he's probably playing it up, but...
I think at one point he was definitely hoping they would do a match, it feels like.
Yeah. But a couple other notes about this Danielson thing. The Observer would later add, Bryan Danielson returned from Japan, and he's apparently learned to live with the shoulder pain. He got through a grueling Noah tour, including a long match with Kenta, and came back with less mobility in his shoulder. I don't have the quote, but I remember Bryan also offhandedly mentioned it in his book that, like, I feel like the Noah tour, he came back like his shoulder was even more deteriorated. But one man was a little bit skeptical, and that would be Brian Alvarez of a source we don't often quote on through the years, Figure 4 Weekly. He wrote at the time, speaking of Bryan Danielson, he claims his shoulder has less flexibility than it did before his trip to Noah, and that he is in pain all the time. ROH may be overplaying this for storyline purposes, as he didn't show any obvious sign of injury in his Noah matches. Generally on this kind of stuff, when like I'll take the Observer over Figure 4 when they disagree on this stuff, although it's not like Figure 4's never been wrong. I mean, never been right in one of these disparities when things don't line up like this. But also Bryan mentioning it in his book years after the fact, when I don't think he has any reason to lie. I have to imagine probably his shoulder probably was in even worse condition, which is probably something to think about when we watch these next few Danielson matches before the end of the year.
Well, also, I mean, he took months off after Final Battle, so that tells you that there was something that he was trying to heal. It's not like he went and like started an acting career during that time.
Yeah. I well, we don't know that. There are all sorts of underground films we don't know, but
yeah, I'm sure there's films that are so underground that in 18 years nobody would have discovered them.
I'm saying Bryan Danielson did a snuff film, Matt. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, jeez.
That brings us to a show that we'll try to determine, is this better or worse than a snuff film? And that would be the Chicago Spectacular, Night 1. It took place December 8th, 2006 at the Frontier Fieldhouse in Chicago Ridge, Illinois, for a reported crowd of 600 fans. So I'll note the last time they ran Chicago was Irresistible Forces. That was the crowd of just shy of 1,000 fans, according to the same source, The Observer. So that's a pretty big drop off for a show to show. And
it's also a Friday night versus a Saturday, and it's a double shot in the same building, which
exactly
makes things tougher, I suppose.
And in fact, we'll go to the Torch talking about that. Ring of Honor is running 2 shows in Chicago on December 8th and December 9th because the other venues they would normally use to run a Midwest double shot were unavailable. It is also a cost-effective move for ROH that allows them to try a new concept. And the Observer would write, the numbers are low for Chicago. When they come back in February, they're going to move to the Windy City Fieldhouse on the other side of town. They'll likely alternate both buildings. Shows were good, although the first night was lacking in the heat department. And boy, we get to that. Boy, was it. And then finally, back to the Figure 4 for one last pre-show note. Brian Alvarez also wrote, crowd was also quiet for this show, and as it turns out, they were quiet all night long. No one had a good reason as to why. The sad thing is that during intermission, a dude came out with a broom to sweep up the ring, and he got one of the bigger pops of the night. The only thing I can think is that ROH isn't usually booked like WWE, and on this night there were 2 DQs and a main event that ended via escape, meaning 3 full matches without a clean finish. Of course, that doesn't explain the crowd being dead from the opening bell.
Now, okay, so Trevor,
yeah,
I have a bone to pick with this narrative. Like, yes, the crowd was quiet. have we not been talking about quiet crowds for months on this show? And
Yeah.
like almost every single one of these shows? Like did this stand out so much more than so many of the other shows? Did it stand out more than the last Chicago show they did? Did it stand out more than the bitter end? Like I don't know. Like I just don't I don't see it. Like I was listening for like this incredibly quiet crowd. It felt like a regular quiet crowd to me.
I would say it didn't stand out in terms of recent ROH shows. I think you're completely right about that. I will say that Chicago, I think, has typically been one of ROH's like liveliest crowds in the last year.
Absolutely,
and I did think this was like a low for them.
I think, but like, which is why I would say like Gut Check and Irresistible Forces both stood out to me a lot. And then by the time they get to this, it's like, all right, I guess this is what it is at this point in time. Like, you know.
Yeah, I mean that is a trend here. Again, that's something that I think an advantage we get rewatching every show, which is if you just drop in, you might get a thing like this where you go, oh, why is this one show really quiet? Where if you watch every show like us, like great point actually. You're gonna be like, well, actually, this is a trend that if you're just dropping in, you're not gonna notice. But on the attendance, I would also say, this was a Friday, and usually Chicago shows were always Saturday because they would usually only run Chicago on the A night of the double shot, which would be a Saturday. But I do think that tomorrow night, also in Chicago, the next night of the show, is also, I think, around 600 fans. So that could be something, I don't know, whenever I try and evaluate these attendances, I never know, what sports events were happening in the time back then. But, there is a common thing where you run the same city 2 nights, you kind of sometimes split the fans. 1,000 fans might be willing to go on a Saturday, but if you tell them there's 2 shows, some of them might pick and choose. So that certainly could be a thing. But they clearly did not see this as an incredible success because I don't think they did this again in Chicago. So that brings us to the dark matches. There were 3 of them. Bobby Dempsey and CJ Otis defeated Ernie Osiris and Mitch Franklin. Team Underground of Chandler McClure and Eric Priest defeated Alex Payne and Rhett Titus. And your dark match main event, Pele Primo defeated Angel Armani. That was your dark match main event. We do not see any of those matches, but we will see a promo Pele Primo did on the pre-show a little bit later. And then we open the DVD proper with Brent Albright sitting in the ring in an empty building before the show starts. He tells us that his name is Brent Albright. He keeps doing that. That's his thing. He goes, it's a name we better get used to because it's going to be a signature name in Ring of Honor. Tonight, he's done messing around. He's not here to just amuse himself. He's here to make money, which is actually a nice little tease for what comes later.
And it's interesting. I'm thinking that this is something intentional. So at the Joe versus Punk 2 DVD, which, that show happened a little more than 2 years before this, the DVD opens with CM Punk sitting in the ring in Chicago in the exact same position, in the exact same setting, like in the corner, talking about his upcoming match with Samoa Joe. And I feel like they must have framed this the same way on purpose because Brent Albright had, I guess, his most well-known feud in OVW and in the entire WWE system was with CM Punk. So I almost feel like that was like an intentional nod to CM Punk to have them shoot the promo in that setup like that.
Are you saying Brent Albright's the new voice of the voiceless, man?
Yeah, unequivocally. New. He's 2006, the new voice of the voiceless.
Finally. We cut to ROH World Champion Bryan Danielson somewhere else. He tells us he just got back from Pro Wrestling Noah where he made half the roster tap out. His shoulder's all banged up, but he's gotten used to the pain and adapted to it. He says tonight he's going to end the myth of Samoa Joe when he beats him in a steel cage. Then Bryan moves on tomorrow night's match where he'll be having a 6-man tag where he'll need to name 2 partners. He says here comes the first partner, and in walks Lacey into frame, who shakes Bryan's hand and says that it's nice to be doing business with him. She thinks the world title would look great in Lacey's Angels. The camera then pans over a bit, and we find Jimmy Jacobs. Bryan shakes Jimmy's hand. He tells him that he saw what he did to BJ Whitmer and Colt Cabana recently, and he's a guy he wants on his team. Jimmy just sheepishly says, if Lacey wants me there. And he and Lacey communicate with each other, communicate with facial expressions, with Bryan standing between them. And Bryan clearly just has no truck for their tomfoolery. He's like just so over these 2 already.
He seems weirded out. He seems weirded out, honestly. Like what the hell is this? These 2 Joker's doing. I liked that Bryan got like a serious promo, at least before the Lacey stuff, because he felt like he had been, even though he'd been on most of the shows before those last two, felt like pretty de-emphasized. So it was nice to be like have a little bit of focus put back on him.
Yeah, absolutely. And the promo ends with Lacey after Bryan walks away in frustration. Lacey wonders what Bryan's problem is. She tells Jimmy to not even focus on tomorrow night. Tonight he needs to destroy Colt Cabana. Do not let me down. And Jimmy just says, anything for you, and pouts, which is, we've seen the ending of that. The ending of this promo we've seen like 9 times now. You know, hurt this guy. I don't care if you win. And then, okay, I'll do it. And I love you. And yeah.
Yep, we are officially over this.
And that brings us to the opening match, Matt. Tank Toland defeated Kikutaro via pinfall in 8 minutes 17 seconds after a sit-out spine buster. I love the idea of this match. Tickles me, Matt. I love the idea of like telling someone that has like a casual knowledge of wrestling history, like, oh yeah, we do a old school ROH podcast, and they're like, oh, what's the next show you're covering? We're like, oh, it's a show in 2006, and it's the main event's Bryan Danielson, Samoa Joe. They're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's very logical. What's the opener? It's Tank Toland versus Kikutaro, which seems like one of the least ROH feeling like matches on paper you could name. What'd you think about this?
It's like the kind of match that Tony Khan might randomly book for the sickos, as they say. I honestly thought this was fine. Like, it was like some legit enjoyable comedy. Wrestling was pretty nondescript, but one of the benefits of the quiet crowd is that you can hear all of the wacky things Tank Toland was saying. Kikutaro was saying. Tank Toland wasn't really saying that many wacky things. Would have been nice. It could have been a back and forth. But Gabe on commentary, he describes the match as a mix of comedy and power. So, like, at one point, like the start of the match, when Kikutaro tries to play the referee, he's like telling the ref and Tank to fight. Like, he's like, you go. And then the ref gets all annoyed. And then there's a spot where Kikutaro does the little bit with the ref where he does the high five, down low, too slow. And then he does that to Tank. And Gabe and I both cannot believe he fell for that one. So there's another spot where he gets down on the mat and challenges Tank to arm wrestling, and Tank doesn't want to do it, and the crowd chants pussy at him, so he finally does it, and then Kikutaro just gets up and stomp him. So I guess Tank Toland's gimmick is that he's particularly dumb and gullible, which, I mean, I guess, honestly, that might be a good gimmick for someone that's kind of positioned like him. So there's a spot where he keeps covering and getting up, and then he yells, "It's joking!" until the ref shoves him, and then Tank attacks him and finally takes control. Then we get to the part where Tank just dominates Kikutaro, which is, I mean, it just looks like a velocity squash, honestly, when Tank is on offense, which, makes sense. He does a chin lock and all that stuff. He keeps putting Kikutaro back in the center every time he gets near the ropes. They do the arm drop spot. And actually, Kikutaro does some wrestling. He does a pretty decent dragon screw, and then, he does the Shining Wizard, gets a 2 count there. And then when he gets Tank in like a front face lock, he yells to the crowd for a long time. It's like he thanks them, thanking them for coming, tells them to come tomorrow. And then he says, "This is the match's final move," which I like. But before he can hit it, Tank just suplexes him, hits a sit-down powerbomb, and wins. So yeah, I mean, you heard Trevor was giggling at some of the spots that I described because it was legitimately enjoyable. As far as Kikutaro comedy goes, this was a good one. I enjoyed it, and this might not be for everybody, and the wrestling wasn't particularly good, but I can't say I wasn't entertained.
Yeah, I would say unfortunately, the idea of this match tickled me more than the match itself. But there was fun when Kikutaro was doing comedy, which was basically the bookends of the match at the start. And at the end, you went over basically most of the fun stuff. I have no idea if I saw Kikutaro regularly, if his routines would get old to me. Like, they probably would, because I was thinking today as I was setting up for the podcast about this match. Strangely, of all the matches on the show, this is the match I was thinking of right before we started. But I was thinking, like, compared to stand-up comedy where, different comedians do different stuff, but generally a common practice with stand-up comedians is like you work on a set and then eventually you kind of dial in like a good 40 minutes to an hour plus of material. And then you kind of tour that consistently for like a year, 2 years. Some comedians do hang on to the same set for quite a lot longer than that even. And you do basically, you might swap in one bit here or there, ad lib here or there, but usually it's the same stuff for at least a year. And that's fine because you're seeing like a new audience every night. And I feel like I was thinking like the plight of the comedy wrestler is so crazy when you think about it, because you're often in front of the same crowd. And it is one of those things where if you see the same joke too often, too regularly, or just too many times, period, it loses it. And I think of a guy like Delirious who, I enjoyed Delirious quite a lot the first time I saw him, but I remember getting sick of him over time. And that's not necessarily a slight on him as much as it's just the idea of I don't know how many comedy wrestlers in wrestling history could I watch like do 30 matches a year.
Yeah, Kikutaro definitely works best in ROH. Like he's an attraction. He comes in every once in a blue moon, and that works best. I don't know how he would be able to work the same audience all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of getting to my long-winded point, which is I feel like for me personally, Kikutaro's a guy where if I saw him like once or twice a year, I would probably love him till the end of my life, who knows how long that will be. But
let's not get morbid. I know it's hard. That's kind of our thing.
Okay, until I'm old and gray, I could probably, but if Kikutaro was a full-time ROH guy, what a world that would be. I might not be feeling the same way because I've already seen most of these spots more. This is not the first time I've seen most of this stuff, but I feel like
he did do a few things that we hadn't seen in ROH before. Like he was definitely more verbal, I would say, than the other matches.
I feel like the end of match spiel, like that's a spot, that's one of my favorite comedy spots ever. And I feel like if I only saw that once a year, I might never get tired of that because I fucking love just the idea of him stopping the match at the end, being so confident and talking for like a good 90 seconds to 2 minutes, like just everything that's on his mind, and then immediately getting countered and losing.
Yeah, and also it's almost like a concert where they're like, oh, we're gonna do one more song. He's like, this is gonna be the last move. Like I enjoy that concept a lot.
And another great point you made, I think, is Kikutaro is like the ultimate small building, like maybe even you should see him up like in live and in person wrestler, because I feel like he is maybe the most verbal wrestler and he is the one you lose the most if you don't hear it. So yeah, that was the one advantage of the show being quiet, like you said, is I feel like a good 40-50% of Kikutaro's entertainment is just his running commentary and like verbal jokes he makes. And there have been shows I've seen where the crowd's been really loud or they haven't mic'd well, where you can definitely tell you're not getting the full experience. And as far as the match, I thought the middle, it was like you call it like a velocity squash. I thought it was kind of it was fine, but a little basic and boring. I feel bad for Tank Tolan where it's like he was just doing like decent fundamental wrestling, but I was like, man, you don't know Ring of Honor where, you already have the odds stacked against you because you came from OVW and WWE system. You had a crazy comedy gimmick. The fans are already on you because they see you as just like a steroid monkey that, doesn't deserve to be there, whether that's fair or not. And I don't think that's completely fair. And
But he had the most WWE look possible, which is not going to endear himself to the Ring of Honor fans.
Yeah, and in fact, I didn't have this in my notes, but I read some note saying that, the muscle weight that Tank Tolan lost in WWE, he's found in Ring of Honor. So like, there's a guy, if anything, you're getting an even more tank version of Tank Tolan at this point in Ring of Honor. But it was one of those things where it's just like, whenever I see a guy where it's like you're getting like 2 or 3 minutes of offense, like you really, that's not always my favorite kind of wrestling, but like this was not the match to slow things down and do like good basic fundamental stuff. This was like to be kind of dumb in a way, like just to be like, what are the coolest things you know how to do them quickly for 2 or 3 minutes before Kikutaro goes back to the comedy. Like, try and make an impression and change these fans' minds. Do not put Kikutaro in a chin lock. I know that will help get the fans behind Kikutaro. I'm sure you learned that from Jim Cornette. That's, again, classic fundamental wrestling that would work great in 1985 Crockett. When you're trying to break into Ring of Honor on an 8-minute opener, I was just like, man, come on, man. But, yeah, otherwise, Yeah, I thought it was perfectly average. It was enjoyable enough for what it was. There was only one thing I wish I could have heard. Before the match, some fan shouts, "You sold," and then I couldn't make out what they said, steroids. And Tank actually reacts to that fan. I don't know who he accused, like who he said Tank sold steroids to, but like Tank does not know selling. Like he reacts to that fan shouting it. So blast the bad Ring of Honor ring mates.
Guilty conscience.
I would love if that was like actually a wrestler or something. Like, I saw you do it. But anyway, that brings us to the second match. The Briscoes, Jay and Mark, defeated Irish Airborne of Dave and Jake Christ in 5 minutes, 33 seconds when Jay pinned Jake Christ after the Briscoes hit a springboard doomsday device. I would consider this to be the Irish Airborne's last match last weekend in ROH because they'd work the next night as semi-regulars. Like from this point on, they will still do, I would say, like 3 or 4 matches a year for Ring of Honor for the next few years, but basically just in jobber duty. But I think this was the 1 year where, they had over 20 matches in the company. This felt like the one shot they had, to maybe break through as regulars. And clearly Gabe has decided, like, I don't see it. And in fact, this was also like their third match against the Briscoes this year and their third loss to the Briscoes. And if you just look at the match times of their 3 matches, it kind of tells the story of the company losing interest or faith or whatever you want to call it in them. Because their first match against the Briscoes this year was 15 minutes and 9 seconds. And that was clearly like a failed attempt at giving the Irish Airborne a showcase match against a top team where, we see it in Ring of Honor all the time where, yeah, you're an upcoming team. You lose against a big established act, but you get a lot of match time and hopefully you have a great match and steal the show and gain something. And they really didn't. That match was just okay, just decent, kind of disappointing. Then they got the rematch a month later after they had pinned the Briscoes in an Ultimate Endurance, like multi-man tag out of nowhere. And that rematch a month later only went 10:47, so basically 5 minutes less. And that match felt like Ring of Honor giving up on the Irish Airborne because that was, basically the Briscoes immediately getting their win back from the Ultimate Endurance match. And then now you have this match where it's 5:33 and it's basically a Briscoe showcase squash match that is being taped for the ROH video wire. So with every match of this trilogy, the Irish Airborne get 5 minutes less, and they feel more and more like the afterthought to, from being like feeling like they're getting a real shot to just giving a pin back to now they just feel like they are literal enhancement talent here. As far as the match, I would say like there's not much to say. That's why I spent so much time on the surroundings of it. This was Briscoes by the numbers. They threw out some of their hits. They gave Irish Airborne a bit of offense. They let, the Irish Airborne hit a big double dive to the floor late. But this was wrestled, I would say, exactly like what it was supposed to be, which was a 5-minute sampler for people who might not have seen much of the Briscoes to see them for free online. Because, again, this was on tape for the ROH video wire. So this was basically just one of their free kind of, hey, have you never seen the Briscoes before? Here's them squashing a match. So, Matt, this show started with an 8-minute comedy match and a 5-minute squash. We're off to a hot start.
Well, that's like the last show, right? It started with a squash, then a 2-second student match, then kind of like a dull mid-card match. So, like, yeah, it's kind of a pattern with these, I guess, non-AAA shows. Maybe shake it up a little bit. We'll see if it happens anytime soon. But yeah, this match reminded me of the other ROH video wire squash that they had at In Your Face against James Keenan and Jason Blade, where they just get to do a bunch of cool moves. At one point during the match, Gabe says the tag team scene is red hot here in ROH, and I was like, maybe, but I don't know if this match is the one that would exemplify that. I guess there are 5 teams, and Irish Airborne is one of them, but so I guess maybe. But, the Briscoes did look good in their offense. They kept it fast-paced. It wasn't boring, which is good. Wasn't great or anything, but it wasn't boring. You'd definitely rather have had a more exciting competitive match. In my notes, I noted that an ROH Video Wire match was like the 2006 version of WWE Speed. And then I realized that in 2 consecutive matches, I mentioned WWE Velocity and then WWE Speed. So then I realized those words mean the same thing. And I was like, oh my God, Velocity became Speed.
Do you think it's going to be?
I figured it out.
In 20 years, it's going to be like an even faster show where it's just 1-minute matches, and it's going to have an even WWE Turbo.
Yeah, Turbo. There you go. Perfect. A 3-second match. If you don't get a pin immediately, the match is declared a draw.
If you don't do it's like the equivalent of like that old Comedy Central show, Make Me Laugh, where like if you don't make the man immediately say "I submit," like within 5 seconds, if you don't horrify them somehow, this match goes to a draw every time.
Yeah, you get like a pre-match, like 10-second staring contest, and then once the match starts, you have 3 seconds to win it. So the staring contest has to make the person submit, is what I'm trying to say. WWE Turbo. That sounds exciting. Staring contest. Woo.
So yeah, next we go from one exciting thing to another, Matt, because we get I like Pele Primo. I like these getting some TV time. So we get, or DVD time. Next we get a clip from tonight's pre-show, which is Pele Primo taking the mic in the ring after he won his match, which we don't see. He says he should be celebrating after this win, crowd surfing all over this building, but he has something on his mind. He says Shane Hagedorn. For months, Shane's been parading around the top of the class trophy that he doesn't deserve. He's been using brass knucks to win matches. He's been bullying all the other ROH students. Pele says he's calling him out for tomorrow night in a match for the top of the class trophy. And then he says he'll be crowd surfing all over the building, then crowd surf to Nome, Alaska, where to celebrate with his family, because that's where he's from. Then crowd surf to Philadelphia, where he currently resides. I love that at the end he added where I currently reside. So he's like giving you a little tour. Like, if you're wondering why I'd be crowd surfing to Philadelphia, it's because it's where I live now.
Well, he doesn't want to break the gimmick about being from Nome, Alaska. I don't know. Maybe he is from Nome, Alaska. I don't think so, though. But you know what? He's been known to listen every time or two. Pele, are you really from Nome, Alaska? Let us know. I'm gonna guess it's a gimmick, because Nome, Alaska is pretty far away. I wonder if they have wrestling schools in Alaska.
I know, like, once in a blue moon, you'll hear like a couple wrestlers are like making the trip up to do some crazy indie show in Alaska, and I always wonder,
I guess if there are indies, there must be a wrestling school there.
I always wondered, like, how much of a lost leader must that be, unless like you're living in a town maybe of a few hundred people where it's so starved for entertainment that like every single person's going to come. Okay, we got to see some wrestling, because otherwise you'd have to think just the transportation, and I imagine some wrestlers might do it just for the story, but I imagine like, hey, do you want to travel to Alaska to do a wrestling show? Like, you can't really do much of a loop while you're there, I imagine. So
yeah, I know, like, because I have friends who are like doctors who, like, one of them kind of moved to a fairly remote place because they pay a lot of money to get a doctor to come to a place where no one wants to necessarily move to. So maybe it's similar for an indie wrestling show. They'll pay a lot of money to get like Tank Toland to come to do a spot show there because he's been in WWE before. I don't know.
I just Googled independent wrestling in Alaska. There's a company called WrestlePro Alaska. They're doing their 5th anniversary Super Show May 3rd. So their website is outdated. But Matt, this is their card. Oh, you'll never believe this. This is insane, Matt. So their main event for the show, it is billed as the first ever steel cage match in Alaska. It's a man named Dion Russman. You know who he's facing, the defending champ? So he's the champ of WrestlePro Alaska. It's a former Ring of Honor wrestler. It's Dan Moff. Dan Moff is the champ of WrestlePro Alaska. Also appearing on the show, Matt. Let me run down this card. I mean, it's not a card, but a roster. Scott Garland, that's the former Scotty 2 Hottie. Tommy Dreamer. I do think Tommy Dreamer is the least surprising name on this list. I think I could run an indie show, and I think Tommy Dreamer would show up. He's just into that.
Well, first of all, if you ran an indie show, a lot of people would show up. That would be like a destination event, Trevor.
But here are the other people on the show that they've listed: Josh Woods, Cheeseburger, Lady Frost, Jay Lethal, LSG, the Ace of Space, and Colt Cabana. So quite a few ROH alumni work in Alaska.
Yeah, it's honestly not a bad lineup at all.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to if you live in Alaska, I would not expect to get that many like recognizable names. But you know what? Maybe I've been underestimating Alaska, Matt. If there's one thing we're learning today.
And by the way, as I Googled Pele Primo while you were Googling Alaska wrestling, and at least what I found says that he was born in Philadelphia, which is what I suspected. That doesn't mean it's true. I mean, for all we know, he really is from Nome, Alaska, but that is not my hunch.
If a wrestler's lied to us, Matt, I honestly don't know what I'm going to be doing.
I mean, I feel like it's an extreme gimmick to say you're from a place like Nome, Alaska, because there are not many well-known wrestlers that are actually from Alaska, or even billed as being from Alaska, now that I think about it.
And that brings us to the third match on the show, and that would be Homicide defeating the Voice of the Voiceless 2006, Brent Albright, by disqualification in 13 minutes, 5 seconds, when Albright would not release his signature crowbar submission on a rope break. Matt, this is easily Brent Albright's biggest match so far in his short Ring of Honor tenure. Big top name, 13 minutes. He gets a finish that's absolutely shocking, Matt. Doesn't happen very often in Ring of Honor. What'd you think about this?
All right. Well, crowd heat, an issue. I think the match had its moments. I think the beginning, was pretty good. Fairly fast paced. So there was so basically the way it started was Homicide was really making a big deal about shaking hands. And at one point he goes to Todd Sinclair. He goes, "Why do we have to shake hands? It's wrestling." So Homicide, newcomer to Ring of Honor, has to learn the rules of the promotion. And then at that point, Homicide gets pissed and Albright gets pissed and grabs Homicide, yells at him to shake his hand. And the Homicide continues to stall, which is definitely the most dramatic part of the whole match. So Homicide continually stalls until Albright just jumps him. And so they start hot and heavy. Homicide's moving fast. They get to the outside. They're within the 2-minute mark. They're on the outside. Homicide's repeatedly ramming Albright into the guardrail, which is the first real beating Albright has taken in ROH. And then, Albright throws Homicide into the rail. Homicide responds by hitting him with a chair. And Todd Sinclair, ever the authority figure during the match, he literally says this to Homicide while he's hitting Albright with a chair. He says, "Knock it off!" A couple of times he says that. And I was hoping he would call him a knucklehead next. "Knock it off, you nincompoop." But at that one point, Sinclair just grabs the chair away. So I guess that's as close as he gets. Also, during this point in the match, at that point, Albright takes over with a neck breaker, and that's when things start to slow down into a way that you might expect. This is the point also where Gabe announces that Jared David will step down from commentary, and then they turn it into a bit where Gabe says he won't be, or Jimmy Bauer says he won't be of the full-time replacement because they won't let him drink alcohol while he's on commentary. And he says, "It's killing me. I got to get out of the booth." And he says they're going to try to track Lenny Leonard down. So anyway, so that's where the match slows down, and they go back and forth for a while. There's a spot where Homicide goes for a crossbody off the apron, but Albright catches him, lifts him on his shoulder, and rams him shoulder first into the ring post. So that's at the point where they start working over Homicide's shoulder, and Homicide fights back. Albright gets that Splash Mountain hotshot move and half Nelson suplexes him and gets the crowbar. And that's when Homicide makes it to the rope, but Albright won't release the hold, so Sinclair calls for the disqualification. So at that point, I'm like, really a disqualification? We don't see that too often. When they reveal the angle, which is that Danielson was at the entranceway paying Albright cash right in front of everybody to show that he was paying him off to injure Homicide. I had a couple of thoughts. One, that's a little bit on the nose for Danielson to just be standing there giving him the money, with a little smile. But also, I don't know if I like Bryan Danielson being that vile. It just feels like sometimes they kind of, I don't know, are inconsistent with just how bad Danielson is. Is he a true deep villain? This is a true deep villain move. Other times he's just sort of arrogant, but still a very honorable wrestler. So it's I don't know if this really fits the character that I thought that Danielson was supposed to be. And that was weird. As far as the DQ finish, it's at this point in the show, it's okay, DQs are rare enough that it could be okay. Once we get to later in the show, it becomes a little bit less acceptable for different reasons, but like I said, we'll get to that later. But yeah, I feel like the match wasn't great. It had a couple of moments. The ending, I don't think that I liked it, even though I understood what they were going for.
Yeah, this might be the fastest paced match we've seen from Brent Albright so far in this short ROH run. It's also the match where he's been on the defense the most by far. Homicide controls actually most of this match, I would say. Albright does not get an insignificant amount of offense, but he's like rarely stringing many moves together before Homicide strikes back. It really did feel like one of those matches where it was like, okay, we're pushing Albright right now, right out of the gate, so we want him to be strong. So, the finish hopefully will make him kind of strong. But Homicide's in the midst of his biggest push ever. He's about to become the world champion, so he needs to be strong too. So let's give him most of the match. But it was weird because I felt this match was kind of bland and boring most of the way. Not bad, but just meh. Very generic action. And also, I just felt like the way these two guys' bodies lined up was a little awkward at time. Like, they're just very different sizes and very different shapes. And there was just a few moves where they didn't kind of connect great. There's like Homicide throws a drop kick, and sometimes his drop kicks aren't always good. And this one was pretty bad, where it's like he doesn't get very high, like gets up to his midsection, only barely connects with one foot. I do always love, and you get that in this match, where Homicide, in the midst of his biggest babyface run ever, is still like a consistent crazy asshole, because like you said, he refuses to shake Albright's hand. He's like does incredulous that that's even a thing in a company he's been in almost every show on for years. He keeps trying to hit Albright with the chairs on the outside for no reason. like Albright did not do anything particularly mean to him. He like Homicide was not in a desperate situation. He actually succeeds once in full view of the ref. Like I do kind of like that even as a face, Homicide is just a lunatic. Like, he's consistent in that, where he changes a bit when he's a face or a heel, but he's never not unhinged in some ways. And then, in the final few minutes, that's when you get like any kind of story to sink the match. I mean, to sink your teeth into. Albright catches Homicide on a dive, throws him shoulder first to the ring post, and re-injures the shoulder. Homicide famously, like, legitimately injured against Steve Corino the year before. But at that point, there isn't actually much time left in the match, and Homicide even lands some offense in the little bit of time they have left. So it's not really like a huge story. Like, it's the big storyline of the match, but they don't spend that much time on it. And I thought this was like a very high average to like a very low above average. I would call the match an honest effort from Homicide, but not like a try to steal the show level or anything close to that. And I thought in a vacuum, I thought the finish would be fine because it works for the story. But in the context of this show, like you alluded to, the finish we're going to see later, the fact that the show isn't exactly off to an incredibly hot start, that's a little. Dave Meltzer wrote on The Observer, the crowd wasn't much into the match, but the post-match was strong. Look at my notes. We did get a next world champ chant for Homicide, so the fans were really into that. The idea that he's coming on the title. Don't clip that.
I mean, we don't know.
It's been done before in wrestling, Matt. It's been done before in wrestling. That's all I'll say. And what I did like was there's a next world champ chant, and then there was a much weaker LAX chant. And I love, like, in these crowds, there's always you can start to get like these little pockets of people that like TNA, maybe even are showing up because of TNA, and then there's larger pockets of people that either actively dislike TNA because their history of Ring of Honor or don't give a shit. So like there was like people very excited that Homicide's going for the ROH title, less excited, but some people excited that he's part of LAX. And you mentioned the thing on commentary where Gabe mentioned Jared David is stepping down as commentator. That's an interesting thing because on the last double shot, I believe, they said something to the effect of like, Jared's sick, but he'll be back soon. And on this one double shot later, complete change of tone. It's like, he's not coming back. We wish him well.
But he stayed with FIP, right?
I think so. I wonder if there was just something came up where for a brief time they did think it was funny, like the way Gabe talked about Lenny. Like it wasn't exactly the best way to sell Lenny Leonard coming back, where it sounded like, like you said, like, let's hope we can track him down. Like the idea of basically, well, we've lost this guy we wanted to keep. Maybe we can get Lenny again. I was like, that's not the greatest way to sell Lenny Leonard. But anyway, after the match, Brent Albright refuses to release the crowbar until Samoa Joe runs down to the ring and he chases him off. Bryan Danielson, like Matt said, shows up at the entranceway and he hands Albright a bunch of money. He paid him off to hurt Homicide. And in the ring, Joe grabs the mic and yells, "Are you serious?" The crowd chants, "Fuck you, Dragon," as Homicide continues to clutch at his injured shoulder. Joe says, "Tonight, Chicago witnesses a murder and thousands of fans will cheer it on." I'll note, I don't think Chicago has ever drawn like more than 1,000 fans. And tonight they're doing like one of their worst crowds of like 600. But thousands will cheer it on tonight. So maybe there are people that'll be listening intently from outside the building.
I mean, it would have sounded bad if he was like, "Dozens will cheer it on."
600 I mean, hundreds of fans? I don't know. Might sound okay. But Joe asks Bryan if what he did just now is what a champion does. But then he adds, it doesn't matter because tonight he's regaining the ROH title. Joe helps Homicide as he tells Joe that he better kill Homicide tonight. So on the angle, I would just say, I did think it was kind of ill-fitting for Danielson, like you did. I didn't think it was as much as Danielson being evil, as much as it just felt like Bryan Danielson is so the socialist, like anti-capitalist wrestler. Like that used to be part of his promos a year earlier. The idea of the guy being like, "I've got all the money for you, Brent Albright." Like it just didn't seem to fit the character.
That's true, also. But yeah, but you don't think it was like too dastardly for like what he portrays normally?
It's definitely a step where, I mean, a lot of the year he was kind of consistently like a tweener in that he was always kind of consistently an asshole, but an asshole in a way that you could cheer for him if he was facing a heel. And I do think you're right where this is like crosses that line where there is no wiggle room on this. Like that is a dastardly thing to do, you know, above and beyond. And obviously this is also, we'll see later that they're going to reinforce that, you know, this is Brent Albright's kind of initial Ring of Honor character now, which is he's just a hired gun, you know, who will basically take money from anybody to take out people. Doesn't matter who. He doesn't really have an alliance at this point yet. The Bryan Danielson, and I didn't even think of it till you mentioned it, but yeah, you're completely right also about like how dumb, like it's one of those things that you're only doing because you need it for the storytelling for the fans. But like, in what world do you not just give him the money backstage and keep it a mystery? Like, I mean, I guess you could say Bryan's that arrogant, but like the idea that you're like the second it happens, you're walking to the curtain being like, I got your money. Like Brent Albright doesn't even have anywhere to stick it in. He's in his trunks. Like you're just like, here you go. But that brings us to a four-corner survival match. B.J. Whitmer defeated Christopher Daniels, escorted to the ring by Allison Danger, Davey Richards, and Matt Cross in 1701 when Whitmer pinned Cross after he hit the adrenaline spike, which is basically a sit-out tombstone. Matt, I was dreading this match going in. This hasn't exactly been a barn burner of a show thus far, as you might be able to tell from our review if you aren't watching the show along with us. And this on paper seemed to me to be like, oh, this is your classic ROH random-ass spare parts four-way where you booked your roster for the show, you booked most of them big, meaningful matches, and you were like, oh, we got 4 guys left over that are booked for the show. What are we going to do? Random four-way. And I've also been down on Christopher Daniels a bit lately. And yet I ended up liking this a fair amount. Like, this is not a match you have to go out and see, but I would say this is like a strong, good, like 3.25 to 3.5 stars. The match, even working against it again, like the match does what so many ROH four-ways do, which is they just decide to pretend it's a tag match because they don't want to work a four-way. But even that is a little bit better than usual because the first half of this match is Daniels and Whitmer tagging in back and forth to isolate Matt Cross. And at least that makes sense because Whitmer and Daniels used to be stablemates together in the Prophecy, and it all builds to a Davey Richards hot tag. And again, at least it felt a little less arbitrary, and Matt Cross being beat on gives the match a little bit of structure. And then up to this point in the match, like the whole first part, I would call the match like mildly pleasant, like one notch above the body of the Homicide Albright match for me. And to me, that notch is the difference between like blandly average and mildly pleasant. A huge praise, I know, but like, and maybe the difference was that this match had a bit more structure to it in the body of the match. But then Cross tags out and we still have a lot of time left in the match. And while Like, this match does not then go to the absolute most breakneck pace I've ever seen an ROH multi-man go. From the point where Cross tags out, it gets pretty darn fun. Like, it's a real good back section of the match where everyone's coming in and out and doing the big spots, and almost all of the big spots involve Matt Cross somehow. Like, he does his space flying tiger drop into the Rana, which is one of those spots where if he hits it well, it just blows the roof off a building, and he did it great here. The crowd explodes. You get a cool spot where Christopher Daniels reverse Rana's Matt Cross off the turnbuckles into a moonsault on BJ Whitmer. And it really, like, almost every cool move that happens in the second half of the match involves Matt Cross somehow. And between that and him being the face and peril for the first half, this really felt like a match where, whether it was Gabe instructing the guys or just the guys in the match deciding for themselves, that they sat down and decided, like, let's make the goal of this match to try and get Matt Cross like a full-time job here. Like, let's get him over. Because this is a match that really felt like built to spotlight Matt Cross. And overall, I would just say this is a match I kind of needed, in the sense of the last match had like a decent pace and amount of action, but I just felt cold to it. And I felt like that more often in the back. I felt like that kind of feeling more often in the back half of this year in Ring of Honor. And I keep having this feeling sometimes where I'm like, am I just getting burnt out or sick of matches that aren't absolutely top level, or the craziest spot fest, or matches with a real story? But because I've been making those last two criticisms more often on the show lately. But then I see a match like this, and it's like, nope, because it's mostly just there to be action, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. Like, it did have a little bit of structure, so maybe that was the difference. But overall, I would say, like, it was nice, Matt, I would just say, to see a match that I felt like is something I enjoyed a fair bit in the moment, but was simultaneously something I will forget in a month. Like, the world needs more matches like that too. Not everything there needs to be a tier of matches between disappointing and I'm going to remember this forever. And it did that for me. It restored my faith in fairly good, Matt.
Yeah, well, also, like, this match the crowd wasn't dead for, and that makes a big difference on how these matches come across, right? Like, when they get the crowd rocking like they did in the last part of this match, even getting a brief "This is awesome" chant, which you didn't hear too much during this, like, few month period, it makes a big difference in how the match comes across on video. And yeah, Cross did great here. Obviously, the other wrestlers in the match facilitated that very well. And yeah, it felt in some ways like a 2003 Four Corner Survival, in that everyone was just kind of like going for it. Even Daniels, to me, seemed more aggressive and hard-hitting than usual. And yeah, I feel pretty much exactly the way you felt about this match. I really can't think of anything that I would say that you didn't, except maybe that I thought the match peaked a little too early. Like, I think, like, after that space flying tiger drop into the Rana, like, that was the peak of the match. If they had gone to the finish maybe a couple of spots after that, I think it would have been better, because, like, Whitmer, shortly after, went for like a wrist clutch exploder on Richards, and Richards crated him, and they started doing a bunch of more near falls, and I feel like that would have been the moment to end it. But they do a lot more stuff, and a lot of it's good, some of it, but some of it doesn't get quite the reaction that maybe it would have gotten if it had happened closer to the peak of the match, I guess is what I would say. But yeah, I also, Whitmer and Daniels working together works in the sense that they, were teammates for a while, a few years earlier as well. Davey was definitely in like full meathead mode. Like, he took one of the streamers and like wrapped it around his head at the beginning of the match. like just, there's that. Also, at one point very early in the match, Gabe was like, "Oh, Alice in Danger looking hot at ringside." And like, I always have to wonder, like, what goes through Dave Prazak's head when he has to sit there and hear Gabe like doing that stuff, Like, he and Danger are like partners, and Gabe's just talking about how hot she is. Like, it's just weird. But yeah, no, I pretty much am on the same page as you. I thought that everyone stepped up here, and this was a highlight, one of the highlights of the show. Again, yeah, not anything anyone needs to go out of their way to see, but super fun, got the crowd going, and stood out as far as like Four Corner matches in ROH over the past, I don't know, probably year of ROH.
And a couple notes from the match. BJ Whitmer, like, his nose gets bloody during this match. I was like, oh man, did he break his nose? And I looked up and I found, I believe the Figure 4 Weekly at the time reported that he did in fact break his nose in this match. So coming right back from ankle surgery and one of the first few matches back, you break your nose. I was going to say poor guy. It feels kind of weird to say poor guy about BJ Whitmer based on maybe the last year of events in his life. Maybe I shouldn't feel sympathy for him, but, bad luck to come back and immediately get another injury. The Observer wrote at the time that Davey Richards had Cross in a submission when Whitmer threw him out and took the win. It was the beginning of a 2-night angle that will wind up with Richards getting a regular tag team partner because he needs someone to watch his back. So, yes, this is the starts of, I guess, the first tease of gang warfare, Matt, perhaps in a weird way. This is the first seed being planted.
Yeah, although I don't know if like Richards getting a pin taken from him is an angle that leads to like, oh, I need someone to watch my back. That's just like a normal multi-man match spot,
Yeah. And I believe what Whitmer got the bloody nose on might have been I first noticed it when he came up after Davey Richards did a dive to him on the outside, so I don't know if maybe that hit him or what. Other thing, Daniels comes to the ring with his ROH Tag Team title, but also his TNA X Division Championship. So we can settle it now. Christopher Daniels, less lazy than Bryan Danielson. He was willing to take the 2 belts with him. Bryan Danielson, not willing to take 2 belts with him.
The one word that people use to describe Bryan Danielson, lazy.
Exactly. You bum. Quit whining about your shoulder and your concussions. Rub some ice on it. On your brain.
That title.
The crowd gives the match a standing ovation and ROH chant after, so they enjoyed it quite a bit as well. And then Davey Richards angrily yells at Whitmer for a while before he leaves while saying, damn it, a lot. BJ makes a point to shake Cross's hand, so he's still a babyface. And that brings us to our next match. Jimmy Rave defeated Nigel McGuinness via submission in 12 minutes, 4 seconds, when he made him tap out to his debuting new finisher. The finisher, Bryan Danielson, I think, suggested to him the heel hook from a Boston Crab submission. Matt, the feud is just getting going. Not their first match of the feud, but this is definitely a middle chapter. What do you think about this? We had just seen these guys wrestle a match that I believe you and our guest Tim liked more than me. So how do you think this one stacked up?
Yeah, I like that first one better than you. I'm going to guess I probably like this one better than you too. It was definitely a lot shorter than the first match. The last match was pretty long and they, did a lot of big near falls and stuff like that. Even though, I disagreed with you because you thought they didn't really do that much and I thought they did a lot in that match. This match was pretty simple, but it told a good, simple story, which was Rave working over Nigel's leg. Like that was kind of the move. Nigel started targeting Rave's arm early, and then I thought actually early in the match, Nigel did his move where he does the rope snap into the wrestler's eyes, like while he's on the apron. And I thought this one looked like especially brutal. Like, ow! Like I don't know if I could keep wrestling if I got hit with like that steel cable rope in the eye or like the forehead like that so early in a match. He even does that. That rebound lariat on the floor thing where like Rave tries to throw him into the ring and he bounces off pretty early in the match. And I always like that move. I think that's a pretty cool move. And that's when Gabe says he must have twisted his ankle on the way down. So interesting way to like start an injury spot, but that's what they did. Where like, so he twisted his ankle and he can't even do the headstand because he can't plant off his ankle. Like he really sells it pretty good, almost to the point where it felt like he was really injured. Like that's like the story of the match is Ray focusing on the leg, Nigel really selling it. Like when he tries to get a running start, he can't do it as much. Rave hits actually a dragon screw leg whip, which I can't remember the last time I saw Rave do that move. And I always like it when I see a wrestler break out some new moves, and he actually does it a few times and continues to work over the leg. And then Nigel comes back with ill-considered headbutt, some repeated uppercuts. But, Rave, he ducks the lariat, gets 2 count off a spear, and then he hits a much more deliberate running knee than usual. He actually, telegraphs it. Usually he hits that one out of nowhere. And then he hits what the announcers called formerly known as gonorrhea. And it's like, well, if you don't have a new name, that should just be what it's called, right? And then, Rave starts working the heel hook. Nigel. So here's something interesting. I forgot about this. Rave hit the pedigree and Nigel does the whole big fired up 1 count spot where he pops up. It's like Nigel is pretty ahead of his time because that's that spot.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah. That spot didn't become popular for a few years.
I have that exact thing in my notes. Like, I can't remember. Like, there might have been, but I don't. This is one of, like, the first instances I've seen of, like, this spot, like, a few years later would become, for those who, like, listen to this and did not watch this era, one of the easiest ways in a few years to get a pop on the U.S. Indies for a time was to do a 1 count kick out of a pedigree. And this is, like, one of the first times I think we've seen this chronologically.
Yeah, and like just the fired up 1 count in general of like one, but then you're like, have this burst of energy. Like that's still like a pretty popular spot in wrestling. And it definitely was not in 2006. You barely saw that, at least in America. I don't think even in Japan that was very common at that point. Was it like in 2006?
I don't even know. I am not sure. That might even ebb and flow sometimes.
Yeah,
in
right.
terms. But yeah, you didn't see a ton of Ring of Honor, and again the pedigree spot. I was like you. I was like, whoa! Like I did not expect to see that in 2006 Ring of Honor to do the FU Triple H 1 count pedigree kick out.
Yeah, for sure. Then but like. Nigel, like, he can't cover because his leg hurts too much. He hits a really nice Tower of London. I thought it was a pretty brutal Tower of London, and that got a pretty good near fall. And that's when he goes for a second one. Rave fights it off, hits the missile drop kick to the back, and then Rave spears him off the rebound lariat again and goes for that half crab heel hook and gets the clean tap out. Like, Rave getting a clean win as a heel, I don't know. Like, it's so rare, and, like, you've seen it now a couple times, and it's like, I don't know. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying this series so far. I thought this was a cool, well-worked match with some cool spots. I'm curious to see what you thought.
I liked it too. Like, I agree with pretty much everything you said. I think everything you said. Like, I liked that right off I like this match definitely more than their prior match. Right off the bat, I like that they worked it like they had a beef, like they were jawing before the bell, and then Jimmy hitting Nigel before the bell to start the match off. And you mentioned a few of these moments. It's a match where there are a handful of moments where it's their usual bumps, but they're just seemingly taking them like a notch harder than they normally would take them. Like you mentioned the rope to the eye spot. You mentioned the Tower of London, which I agree, like that's one of the better Tower of Londons we've seen in months, I would think. It looks like Jimmy makes it look like he takes it right on his face. Maybe he did take it right on his face. Who knows? I think another couple other spots I thought, like even like Nigel takes an STO on the apron, and that spot usually looks very impactful, like you wouldn't want to take it. It looks even just a little bit harder, like a half step harder than normal, or even earlier. There's a spot where it's a spot Nigel does all the time, that kind of arm whip where he just like arm rears a guy so hard they kind of whips them to the canvas. And it's a standard move Nigel does, but Jimmy takes it so hard it gets like a like crowd reaction for a move that Nigel does all the time. It just felt like these guys in this match were going for it just like a little bit harder on their bumps. Like, we're going to lay it in a little bit here, which I appreciated. And I thought the opening and the end of the match were good. I thought the middle, which tells the story of the match, it slowed down a little bit. Like, but I really liked the fact that they told the story. I agree with you about that too. Like, Nigel hurts his leg out of nowhere where I agree. Like, it felt like they were trying to sell it that, that Jimmy didn't actually hurt. That was almost like a fluke where Nigel just plants his leg, like you said, doing that rebound layer on the outside, and he immediately starts limping. And like you, I thought he did a great job, almost a too good a job, because a lot of Nigel's moves require him like running great distances, right? Like he'll do the run to the headstand, or he'll run up one side of turnbuckles and then like turn around and fire off them. And he does some running here, and he does a really good job. Like he's doing like really hobbled limps, but it's kind of ridiculous looking because he's running hobbling to the point where you can hear some fans like laughing at him, selling like this serious injury angle. There's a couple of moments where you can literally hear some fans laughing at him. I thought, man, that kind of sucks because he's doing a really good job, but I guess I can kind of see why some fans might say like it's fine just to see a guy like looking like he has a Charlie horse like limping to the bathroom. But Jimmy's leg work I felt like left a little bit to be desired because like apart from whipping Nigel's leg into the barricade, I felt like it was very slow. And while I'm fine with working on a limb via submissions, some of the submissions here were just so basic and lifeless. Like there's one submission in this match where Jimmy holds Nigel's leg between his legs, and it just looks like it would not hurt you at all. Like it actually looks like something you might want to do with a partner when you cuddle. Like I was like, that might be pleasurable just to have someone's, a chum's leg like limply between yours, and you're kind of hugging their leg with your legs and not moving at all. Like was like, I don't know if a submission should not look like maybe that's a goal to have, a relationship goal. But
so you're telling
that's
me a
not
wrestling submission should not look like cuddling?
Exactly.
Okay.
But
well,
then,
that's a in relationships people might be into a different sort of submission,
yeah. I mean, you know what, Matt? You're absolutely right. I'll have to sit down and think about that later in private from my laptop. But
with a title belt in front of you.
On the finish, I like you. I really liked. Like I've been on the record saying on these last few shows that Jimmy Rave, they've taken away so much from his act without adding stuff that he really needed. You can't just subtract without adding. I think the time was right. He really did need a new finisher, and I think as submissions go, like the heel hook and the Boston Crab submission is a perfectly good finisher.
And they added that he now can actually like hold his own as like a tough guy against other tough guys in the company instead of being like kind of a sniveling little heel.
Yeah, like they really try and sell on commentary even that like I think Gabe says I'm like I can't remember Nigel ever submitting, and I don't know if that's true or not. But if it isn't true, I can't remember it happening. Like so if it has happened, it's not often, So they really tried to sell like, hey, this is a big deal that he didn't just beat Nigel McGuinness, he made him tap out. And it's also like it's a better submission than Rave's last submission, because remember like months ago when for a very brief time he tried to make like that submission thing where he just butterflied a guy's arms like while they were on the mat but didn't do anything. Like that's another submission that almost felt like cuddling. And this looks like it could hurt you. This is a much more. My only problem with the finish was he goes for the heel hook for the very first time ever earlier in the match, and Nigel gets to the ropes almost immediately. And then he does it at the end of the match, and when he puts on this time, Nigel taps out immediately. And I thought, if you're debuting this brand new finisher and it's all about how you're taking out Nigel and making him submit, and that's such a big deal, to me, I would have saved the debut of it for the very last spot in the match. I would have not shown it at all until then. I wouldn't have muted the impact by like, well, you can get to the – I would try and make it seem as strong as possible for as long as possible. So, like, it comes out of nowhere, bam, you're dead. But overall, I thought this was, like, a good little match. But more than that, I thought this was a smart match for this stage in their feud. This is, like, the second match of their feud. They still have more matches to go, the bigger ones. And so I felt like doing this kind of injury story, it establishes Jimmy's new submission finisher. It gives him a win that's technically clean while still giving Nigel kind of an out because the injury kind of came out of nowhere on a fluke. It gave the match a reason for not being quite as long as some of their other matches were and will be. I just thought it was a really smartly booked and worked match in that sense. Couple other things I'm going to mention quickly. Often like Jimmy's spears quite a bit, but two of them here looked pretty bad to the point where I couldn't tell if they were meant to be his normal spears or if they were meant to be kind of like a half spear, half leg takedown. And if you listen to the commentary, Dave Prazak seems to be struggling with that too. Like he can't quite tell which one to call it. And the other thing I just want to touch on one more time, like again, the pedigree thing. The thing that really struck me about the 1 count pedigree thing is how much things have changed in our lifetime. Like Triple H when we were young men, Matt, he was like the ultimate symbol of WWE and mainstream wrestling stagnation and like public enemy number one. And now he's the hero. Like he is seen by a lot of wrestling fans as not just a legend, but like this kindly father figure and master promoter. And like whatever you want to say about
what it goes to show you is that people who were there were a lot of people that were just kids back then, and now they're adults. And they didn't know how much everyone hated Triple H in the 2000s. He was just like you remember that Max Landis video? Like, where like talks about how great Triple H is? Like, there was a whole generation of wrestling fans that were like, oh, Triple H is like the ultimate. And like, that seemed crazy for people from our era and our like milieu, And yeah, it's just like there was parallel fandoms. And I don't think the people that were shitting on Triple H in 2006 are the ones that are lionizing him now. At least not for the most part.
It's kind of depressing where like, look, I don't think Triple H is the worst. I think he's kind of overrated from certain crowds now.
And probably at the time a little bit underrated by other crowds. Yeah.
But it is one of those things where it's a kind of reminder that like, if you stay in power and like in prominent positions for long enough, you can outage your critics, because you write the history.
He also is good at marketing himself, like, in a
Yeah,
certain way.
exactly. Yeah.
Like brand, like it's tying himself to that NXT, like we're appealing to the hardcore wrestling fans brand, made him seem more fan friendly. And, in a lot of ways, he is more fan-friendly than Vince McMahon, so that's also, like, who are you comparing yourself to, in a different role. So, but you're right. It's a very interesting evolution in terms of his reputation and the way serious wrestling fans respond to him.
An interesting evolution, huh? I see what you did there.
I should have done it that way, and I didn't. I'm just stupid for not intending the pun. See, that's what, instead of saying no pun intended, people should say, I'm stupid for not intending the pun. That's more honest.
But you make a great point too about like NXT was such a masterstroke by Triple H, and so in like from a PR like rehabbing standpoint, like you could not have come up with a better thing to basically try and win over some of the fans you alienated. Like basically, hey, these ROH indie fans don't like me. How about I just I take the talent and make a higher production version of the wrestling they like and plaster myself all over it. So smart man in that sense. The Observer wrote that after Rave already beat Homicide, they're giving Rave a lot of strong wins to make him a title contender. The idea here is that McGuinness wouldn't even submit to Danielson, but Rave beat him. So they don't really mention that in commentary, but that's another good point too. The idea of like, Danielson's beaten McGuinness, but he didn't tap him out, and Jimmy Rave did. The other thing I wrote in my notes, just look at my notes, it says, I wrote, if you look right before Nigel's entrance starts, someone throws either toilet paper or a white streamer in the ring at Rave, and he kicks it out of the ring. So I wonder if some fan dared to go against the no toilet paper edict that Ring of Honor had launched for this new push. But
it might have been a streamer because, Davey did have that white streamer wrapped around his head also.
I guess you could say any streamer can be toilet paper if you want it to be bad enough. But
for sure. But the problem is it flushable? That's the question.
Yeah,
will it clog up your drain? I need to know this.
Matt, there's only one way to find out. We'll be back next episode to give you the results. But
where do I get streamers from?
I don't know. I would guess a dollar store or like a party center store.
All right, Party City, here I come.
Imagine us going to Party City and being like, "Can we get some streamers? Do you have any flushable streamers? How biodegradable do these? Would these dissolve in a 2,000 flushes?" But after the match, Gabe really tries to sell Rave's new submission, saying it must be a hell of a hold because he can't remember Nigel tapping to anything. In the ring, Jimmy Rave grabs the mic. He tells Nigel that the last time they were in the ring together, Nigel disrespected him by throwing toilet paper at him. This gets a toilet paper chant that is louder than anything I think the crowd actually did during their match, which I should know this crowd did not give this match hardly anything at all, and I felt they deserved more than what they got. Jimmy says tonight he made Nigel tap like a little bitch, and he wants an apology. He hands the mic to Nigel, who tells Jimmy that, hey, yeah, tonight you were the better man, but I'm not going to apologize to you. And then he dares Jimmy, smack me in the face again like he did after our last match. Jimmy instead leaves the ring, and then when Nigel turns his back, Jimmy immediately runs back in the ring. He puts Nigel back in the heel hook, holds on till a bunch of ROH wrestling students and refs break it up, so the feud must continue. Then it was intermission, and Dave Prazak is backstage with ROH World Champion Bryan Danielson. And in a moment that made me laugh, Dave Prazak asked Bryan Danielson if he paid off Brent Albright to hurt Homicide tonight, which seems, Matt, like a very needless question, seeing that we saw him literally hand Brent Albright money and cackle immediately after he hurt Homicide. Like, why you need to ask that one?
If he's trying to act like, if he's trying to play it off like it didn't happen, why would he come out in front of the fans and hand him the money? Like, it's weird. Like, if he's coming out there, you'd think it's because he wants everyone to know. But now when he's asked, he's like, that's none of your business.
Exactly. Bryan tells Prazak, that's the next thing, it's none of his business. He accuses Prazak of being a Samoa Joe sympathizer, and says tonight's match against him will be the easiest cage match in all of wrestling history. Tonight he will destroy the myth of Samoa Joe. And then he tells Prazak he's going to give him a scoop of who his third man for tomorrow's tag match will be, and he brings in Jimmy Rave. He asks Prazak if he just saw what Rave did to Nigel McGuinness and says Jimmy's now all about snapping tendons and breaking ankles. And Bryan says, I like that a lot. And then Jimmy says if Nigel gets in his face again, he'll finish the job. So, yeah, so the interesting thing, one interesting thing about this show is, Fridays were almost always in Ring of Honor the B show because Friday nights you're getting less fans typically, and so you run the smaller market, and you get the lesser card. This was like on paper the bigger card, and yet they spend a lot of this night building to a kind of meaningless 8-man what will become an 8-man tag tomorrow night match. Like they spend a lot of what should be on paper the A show building to what's the B show, but the B show is usually is now on the A show. Now, it's a weird thing on this show. It's a weird situation.
It is strange. We'll talk about it more in the main event. Like that Samoa Joe versus Bryan Danielson feud, like should have felt like a much bigger deal than it ended up feeling like, and that kind of exemplifies it. Like they're not really treating it like that. They're talking about the next night when Bryan Danielson should theoretically be worried about like the biggest match of his run against Samoa Joe in the cage. And it certainly doesn't feel anywhere close to the biggest match of his run.
Yeah, exactly. So after the match, we get our first match back. After the promo, our first match back from intermission, Ace Steel and Delirious defeated Adam Pearce and Shane Hagedorn in 11 minutes, 12 seconds when Delirious made Hagedorn tap out to the Cobra stretch. Before the match, Ace Steel jumps up and poses on the turnbuckles. Adam Pearce tries to copy him by doing that, and he jumps on the turnbuckles and deliberately slips and falls like a buffoon heel.
I wrote the word buffoon in all caps. He said he's playing the buffoon. Get it? Do you see him being a buffoon?
And then when Delirious does his usual stay motionless in the corner before the bell, Ace gets on the house mic and actually makes like Delirious noises to try and get Delirious to react. It doesn't work. This was your classic ease the fans back into the show after intermission match. You've got the wacky crowd favorite Delirious. You've got a hometown favorite for Chicago with Ace Steel. And you've got two of the most clear heels in the promotion at this point. And it's a very basic, very old school style match. There's some comedy. There's some standard heel cheating behind the ref's back. Like Pearce is using the strap to choke Ace behind the ref's back, building, the supposed strap match we're supposed to get the next night against Pearce and Homicide. We get, we get the missed tag due to distraction. Even the old ref kicks a heel's hands as he holds onto the rope spot. And then later we get, the heels get their just desserts. Pearce and Hagedorn get pushed and bump into multiple homoerotic positions. I thought of it as a match this was pure average. It was perfectly watchable, very forgettable. I guess there is a story element in the sense that Delirious has been having a little mini feud with Pearce and Hagedorn lately, with the story being Jim Cornette as commissioner was sick of Delirious pestering him, and so he sicked his henchmen on him, and Hagedorn recently cost Delirious a match against Pearce. So I guess you could say this is Gabe, dotting the I's and crossing the T's as usual, and, continuing this grand storyline, Matt. But really, in practice, this was just a very low-impact match that you generally would only run, I feel like, in this kind of spot, like the first match back for intermission. My favorite part of the whole match was during the match, Ace Steel does his usual thing where he screams, "Someone's going to die." And then Pearce later to Moxley goes, "Someone's going to suck my dick." And Shane Hagedorn, perfectly playing the role of a toady heel, he just goes, "Yeah." And not like he's not in a tone where he's like, he's not into the idea. It's not like he's into Adam Pearce's dick getting sucked, but more just like the idea that that Adam Pearce is going to have a good night tonight. Like I love that he's such a cheerleader. He's just like, "Yeah, you are. You're gonna get your dick sucked tonight." And this was a very sexual match because there's another point in the match where a fan calls Adam Pearce a pussy, and he goes, "I am what I eat." And between that and the sexual positions, this is a very randy match, Matt. Did you get horny watching this match?
I feel like people are going to get horny listening to this episode of the podcast with all the references that we're making. Yeah, I would say I agree with you about the match. It was just very simple, basic heel stuff. I think the stuff with Delirious and Steel before the match went on a little too long because there were some fans that started chanting "Ring the bell," which I know was because they wanted Delirious to run around and go crazy. But also I think they were just like, all right, get on with it already, because I felt a little bit of the same way. The whole part where that's where Steel was quacking at Delirious and then speaking Delirious-ese to him. But yeah, I do think that Steel and Delirious are a pretty compatible team. Like I could have maybe enjoyed seeing them have a little run because I think they did do some good fun shtick together. There's one spot in the match. Maybe you can explain this to me when heels do this. Like they're standing behind the ref's back and they switch places without tagging, but one guy slaps his own hand so the referee thinks there was a tag. And I'm always like, why don't they just tag in that situation? It doesn't is it just because like we're heels and we're just gonna not tag because we can? Like, is that the idea?
I guess, and also it's a weird logic thing because think about this too. Like, shouldn't if that really works, and it generally when heels does it does work, right? Because the ref never just always lets them do the tag.
Yeah.
Like, shouldn't every tag team do that? Every tag they make, because then if you're a babyface, if that trick works, there's no missed tag ever when the heels distract the ref because you can just go, look, not only did I tag, I clapped after the tag, so you heard it, ref.
Yeah.
It's a weird logic hole.
Yeah, it's almost like that's is that a rule? Like as long as the ref hears a tag, so actually it makes more sense to hit your own hand because it's going to be louder.
Exactly. Yeah, you should just clap every time there's a tag. You should just clap to be safe.
Yeah, clap instead. I never understood that spot, and people still do it sometimes. I didn't think that Delirious, like the way that Steel got to the hot tag by crawling through Pierce's legs was so great. Like I think it just kind of felt kind of random. But yeah, I thought that it was pretty good, except I really don't like the gay baiting and like the gay panic spots. I find that stuff, very off-putting. And again, it's 2006 and I don't think they would do that stuff now, but it just, the homophobia of it always stands out. And, I feel like, it just felt like Billy and Chuck stuff. It's where Pierce ended up behind Hagedorn in the corner, and then the faces drop kick Pierce and drop toe hold Hagedorn into Pierce's crotch. And it's just like, I don't know, it just makes the match feel ancient to me.
Yeah.
And I don't love that. But save for that, I thought this was a perfectly fine, unmemorable, but decent house show match to continue a little feud. The only thing I would say is they are building both Pierce and Delirious up for big matches the next night. I don't know if they knew that about how big Delirious's match would be the next night, but because I think it ends up being even bigger for him than it otherwise was going to be. But I guess somebody had to win, so I guess Hagedorn makes sense to be the guy to take the fall.
Well, Matt, you didn't like the homophobic sexual positions in that match. How would you like it if you had two heels being forced into a sexual position, but it was a man and woman? Because if so, Matt, I've got the match for you. That would be Colt Cabana defeating Jimmy Jacobs, scored to the ring by Lacey by disqualification in 7 minutes, 24 seconds when Lacey threw powder in Colt Cabana's face in full view of the ref. This, in some ways, I would say this is the second biggest match on the show, and from a marquee point, maybe the weekend, because they had spent a bunch of shows building up the Cabana Jacob storyline. This is the first time they wrestle each other, and it goes 7 minutes. And what do you think about what this match turned out to be?
Well, even in the Observer, they said this match is more of an angle than a match, and I mean that's exactly what it was. It was very short. It was high energy and action packed, but just to give a little play by play to get to the the spots that you were talking about. So first of all, Jacobs has a beard now, so we know he's going to get edgy very soon. And the crowd does pop when Cabana calls Jacobs a pussy whipped little bitch, and then he does a humping motion, and that causes Jacobs to slap him. And then Jacobs yells in his face, "Do something!" And they start slugging it out. And Colt is definitely more aggressive than usual. He's not doing any comedy. He goes outside and stalks Lacey, which, draws Jacobs out of the ring. I don't think you want to see Colt going after a woman. I think that's, weird for anybody, but especially for him. In fact, there's a spot where Lacey crawls into the ring and Colt grabs her leg, and, Jacobs breaks that up. And then, I guess this is the spot you were talking about where Cabana grabs Lacey by the hair and rams her crotch into Jacob's butt repeatedly, and Prazak's just like, that's different. Did the term pegging exist in 2006? I guess it must have. I probably didn't know it though. But yeah, I take back what I said about no comedy, because I did say that earlier. That was a weird spot, and and they continue to fight. It continues to be an angle. Lacey trips Cabana at one point. At one point, they're fighting on the floor, and Jacobs whips him into the guardrail and then does a leaping forearm off the guardrail. And then as Jacobs is down after that move, Lacey just berates him, and then until Colt picks him up over his shoulder and lawn darts him headfirst into the guardrail, which was honestly one of the scarier spots of the whole show. And then, so even in this angle match, Jacobs is taking kind of insane bumps. Then Cabana goes up top and does the Snuka hoo 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 and yells Superfly, just in case the hoo 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 wasn't enough for you to know that that's who he was referencing, before cross-bodying Jacobs. And then he gets the powerbomb, locks in the Billy Goat's curse, grabs Jacobs' arm for good measure, and that's when Lacey draws the disqualification with the powder, which is kind of remarkable to have a Ring of Honor show with 2 blatant disqualification finishes. Like, that's a very strange move for Gabe. I mean, I get he was trying to set stuff up, but this is Ring of Honor. That's bold of him. I don't know. Like, that's a pretty big sign of burnout to me, because he never would have done that in other eras. I mean, you'll talk about the post-match angle. But yeah, I mean, like, you hear that was I think that was pretty much every spot in the match that I just said. It was a very short match and just basically done for this angle at the end. So I don't really have much to say about the match. I mean, it was energetic enough, but it really wasn't a match.
Yeah, I agree that this wasn't much of a match. We've seen a lot of good brawls in Ring of Honor, like especially in 2006 with the CZW ROH feud, and even with the 2 most recent Briscoes Homicide Samoa Joe tags. And to me, this just paled in comparison to any and all of them. Like, I thought it was very low impact most of the way, like a very meandering pace. Brawls can have a more measured pace, and I can like them. Like, one of my favorite ROH matches ever is Homicide Steve Creel from Bitter Friends, Stiffer Enemies, and that has a methodical pace. But if you're going at a brawl with a more methodical pace, you really need to have like some gravitas. I hate to say that, right? I don't love that word, but behind the moves, like, you need to have some real weight to them. And I felt like most of this match, Cabana and Jacobs' offense didn't have like a ton of weight. Like, Colt was more serious for the most part, I agree, but his strikes are always a bit more of like the wider swing, more comical swings, the bionic elbow stuff. I felt like Jacobs started to throw a few more snug shots later, and Colt doing the long dart into the barricade, that was a very brutal spot that really stood out. But otherwise, I thought this match was fairly tame. We've been spoiled for great brawls lately. This was pretty tame by those standards, not action-packed.
Even by the standards of the Jacobs and Whitmer brawl from the last show, it was pretty tame.
Yeah, and it's made worse by this crowd, which reacts to this match like better than some of the matches on this show, but still shockingly dead, especially when this is, again, Colt Cabana's home market, 2 pushed guys. And the match also makes Jimmy look like a bit of a joke, because Colt dominates him early, and then he seems more focused on chasing Lacey around the ring than on facing Jimmy. And then, even when Lacey distracts Colt to finally let Jimmy get control, Jimmy doesn't maintain control for very long, and Colt seemingly has like Jimmy dead to rights less than 8 minutes into a match with like the Billy Goat's curse submission before Lacey throws the powder to end the match. So I thought this was very low average. On the DQ thing, I would say the one pattern I've noticed with Gabe is I feel like if he feels like he has a really strong main event, he sometimes does more unsatisfying finishes on the undercard because he feels like he can get away with it. So maybe part of him thought, like, you know what, the Joe Danielson, that's a huge blow off to a big feud. It's in a cage. It's going to be a great match. And you know what? I can get away with a couple screwy finishes here. And I think we are both. It sounds like we both agree. You couldn't. I don't think it was something that. I mean, it didn't destroy the show, but yeah, I think both of us view that as a negative. This match felt more like an excuse to do an angle than an attempt to have like a good match. And I feel like you could have had both, right? You could have had like a better 10-minute match here and still done the angle we're about to get to. But maybe if I'm going to be fair, I will say, going to the PW Insider, they wrote at the time, Jimmy Jacobs worked through knee problems this weekend. Colt Cabana was also said to be working through some knee issues over the weekend. So maybe in that sense, maybe we should give these guys a bit of a leeway if they're both working with bad knees on this. And this was a weekend with a bunch of injuries, which we'll get to some more later. Anyway, we get to the angle after the match. Immediately after the match, Lacey grabs at the powder-blinded Colt, but Daisy Hayes almost immediately runs in from the back. She attacks Lacey. The crowd chants for Daisy, so they're into Daisy Hayes. Jimmy pulls her off, and that allows Lacey to hit her with a spinning neck breaker. Lacey then hauls Daisy to her feet and tells Jimmy to get her, and after a brief hesitation, Jimmy spears her, sending Daisy Hayes' shoes flying off her feet out of the ring into the crowd, which gets a bigger pop than maybe anything that had happened all night.
We've talked about this many times. These 2000s indie crowds, they love man-on-woman violence. It's uncomfortable, but they do. They like it a lot. They always react to it.
Maybe they just love shoes, Matt. You're always so cynical. You're thinking the worst of people. Maybe they just love shoes. So the crowd briefly chants, "Holy shit!" And while Lacey is taunting Daisy, a recovered Colt takes out Jimmy and then he grabs Lacey from behind before Brent Albright, he's back again, folks, runs in. He lays Colt out with a suplex. Brent helps Jimmy to his feet, and the two hold Colt's legs apart as Lacey puts on a high heel shoe, stomps Colt right in the balls with it. BJ Whitmer then runs in. He attacks Jacobs, but Albright quickly pulls Jimmy outside of the ring to safety. Lacey screams that she finally has someone she can depend on with Brent Albright as the three of them leave. And then as Colt is being helped to the back by two refs, Delirious runs into the ring. He grabs the mic, cutting a promo to the fans and BJ Whitmer in delirious ease. We can make out that he's saying Bryan Danielson and Jimmy Jacobs a few times, and we can tell he's basically asking BJ Whitmer if he wants to be one of his tag partners in their tag match tomorrow night against Bryan Danielson, Jimmy Jacobs, and Jimmy Rave. BJ asks Delirious, "Is that what you said?" And Delirious confirms, so BJ says yes. Nigel McGuinness then limps to the ring, grabs the mic, and says if Jimmy Rave is going to be in the match tomorrow and Delirious and Whitmer need a partner, then Nigel's their man. Delirious accepts pretty eagerly, for considering that Nigel McGuinness is barely able to walk. Like, if I was Delirious, I might be thinking, maybe someone that doesn't seem to be working with one leg right now. But anyway, so yeah, that's the angle. And again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is a lot of this night felt like it was more to set up like what turns out to be a relatively meaningless 8-man tag on the second night. And it continues the Brent Albright thing, which again, rather than you thinking, oh, Brent Albright's aligned with Bryan Danielson, I think this pretty quickly makes clear, like, no, he's just a gun for fire. He's just a gun for hire at this point. And I would say as a booker, that's got to be like one of the easiest crutches. Like, I don't even necessarily always mean that in a bad way. It's just like the gun for hire, where it's like whenever you just need someone in a feud, you can just write, someone else paid him some money this week.
Yeah, no, I think, but it's simple enough that you never really have to have logic holes. So I actually am fine with it.
Yeah. So like both things tonight, you need someone to hurt Homicide. You don't want Bryan to do it directly. Brent Albright, someone paid him. You need someone to help Lacey and Jacobs for this part of the feud, since it's going to be like Colt and Whitmer on the other side. You can have Brent Albright get hired. So that brings us to the semi-main event. Dragon Gate rules, which basically just means if a wrestler hits the floor, he doesn't have to tag out. His partner can become the legal man immediately. Austin Aries and Roderick Strong defeat Matt Sydal and Shingo, both escorted to the ring by Allison Danger, in 19 minutes, 19 seconds after when Aries pinned. I wrote Strong. That can't be true. He pinned.
Let me check my notes real quick, and I will confirm that Aries pinned Sydal.
After hitting the 450.
Yes.
So apparently this was another match where I didn't notice watching it, but apparently someone got hurt during it, because the Observer wrote, apparently Matt Sydal suffered a knee injury the first night, so the main event that was scheduled on the second night of Christopher Daniels and Matt Sydal defending the ROH tag titles against Aries and Strong was changed. PW Insider wrote, Matt Sydal and Jimmy Jacobs are both scheduled to have their knee issues examined this week by doctors. Sydal's injury looked to be a completely fluke deal, as he took a dropkick in the corner from Austin Aries with his foot not fully planted on the mat. So in a weird way, it sounds like he basically had the shoot version of the knee injury that Nigel McGuinness faked, which was just you didn't plant your foot right and you just tweaked something. But
also, it doesn't seem like Sydal's injury was that major, because he didn't really have a significant amount of time off.
But he does miss the next show, and they have to rebook what was supposed to be a tag title match. So, This was, how do you really stretch out a really thin tag division? You do stuff like this where one half of your tag champs teams up with a non-tag champ and he faces a former champs, and that way they can earn the right to win a tag title shot the next night, except that gets canceled. But at least here, the non-champ partner stuff makes sense because Shingo just feuded with Roderick Strong, and he just cost Aries and Strong a tag title match against the Kings of Wrestling. And he and Matt Sydal are members of the Blood Generation stable in Dragon Gate, so there's a lot of reasons why they might want to team up together. Although, ironically, on commentary, at one point they mentioned, there's that Blood Generation chemistry. I checked on Cage Match, Matt Sydal and Shingo, despite being in the same stable, had never teamed together in a match before this. And next year, when they work in Dragon Gate again, they split up into different stables, and they never have another match together, I think.
Well, but don't you get it? They learn the chemistry because the Blood Generation has all these training sessions behind the scene where they have scrimmage matches. That's got to be
Blood
what
Brothers.
It is. Yeah.
They have to cut each other with a rusty can lid and shake hands. But this is how thin this tag division was at this point. Aries and Strong just had a feud with the Kings of Wrestling where they lost the tag titles, then wrestled the Kings of Wrestling 2 more times after that, with the steps of the third match being if they lose this match, they can never wrestle the Kings of Wrestling for the titles again as long as the Kings are champs. The very next show, Kings of Wrestling lose the tag titles. The very next show after that, Aries and Strong are back in the title picture. They don't have a lot to go with here, until the Briscoes, come in. As far as the match, I would say this is good, not great. It's I would describe this as a rock steady B effort from some really talented people. It's got the pattern of a match they could do in their sleep, even if within the match they're doing some athletic things or they're working hard and hitting hard. You've not just seen this quality of match from these guys before, particularly Strong and Aries. You've seen the rhythm of this match multiple times this year. Sydal gets double teamed for a while, Aries gets double teamed for a while. They go wild in the last few minutes. It just feels like a match I've seen before a lot. It kind of hums along decently, and then the final few minutes get bigger. But I would say this match settles to me at a low 3.5 stars. There have been matches like this in Ring of Honor this year where it kind of is the same level of quality this is for the first 2/3, but then the final third is 7 to 10 minutes, and they just go so insane. I'm that raises this match to a completely different level where this is 4 stars. And this match, I was it doesn't get to that level. It gets to 3.5. Again, this felt like a very autopilot performance for Aries and Strong, and I don't even mean it in a total bad way. It's just, again, it just felt like I've seen everything these guys have done in this match before. I did think the guy that stood out to me was Matt Sydal. Even though I think at this point he was supposed to be a babyface, he's being a real cocky guy in this match to the point where the commentary's pointing it out. And he's coming from what I thought was one of his best ROH performances ever on the last show in the tag title change. I don't think this is quite on that level, but I still think he's just looking so good in his execution of moves. Watching this match, I was also thinking, if there was a wrestler, if I had to pick Trevor, you have to do a spot where you launch a pro wrestler into the air. Which wrestler do you pick? I think if I could pick any wrestler in history, it might be 2006 Matt Sydal, because even on stuff on getting hot shot into the ropes or stuff, he just gets insane air on simple stuff. He gets that hang time where time seems to slow down when he's in the air. And, he does this. If we're talking about spots that are ahead of their time, he does a spot where he and Shingo put Aries on Roddy's shoulders and then sweep Roddy's legs, so they force Roddy to powerbomb Aries, and that's
a crazy spot.
That kind of make your partner powerbomb or pile drive your partner move, that would become a thing that the Young Bucks would do a ton in PWG, or a few teams in PWG would do that a few years down the road. That's another spot where I was kind of shocked to see it in 2006, where that becomes way more prevalent on the U.S. Indies in a few years. But to me, the big spot of the match, the thing I want to end on, is we just saw Sydal do the leap onto your opponent's shoulders and then jump off their shoulders into a DDT spot the show before. That's a spot I mentioned on that show. I love that. So that's one of the coolest spots I've ever seen. It's a spot I remembered, despite not seeing that match 15 years. I did not remember that he did it again the very next show, which I think goes to show you maybe this is me being grumpy. I'm going to want your opinion on this, Matt. Is this me being grumpy where I was the crowd goes wild for it here too, but I was I kind of wish you saved that spot for special occasions. I almost compare it to classic Trevor Dame food analogy time. Sometimes you ever eat a food and you like it so much, you eat it over and over again in a short window and you make yourself sick of it. And then there's sometimes a food that's so special, you're like, I'm not going to let myself do that. Like, this is so special, I'm only going to let myself eat this like once a month, once every 2 months. I'm never going to want – I never want to get used to this. To me, a spot like the Seidel jump on the shoulders, jump into the DDT spot, it's so cool. I always want it to be a surprise. I always want it to be special. And I was kind of like shocked to see it a second time. I was like, man, I don't want to ever take this for granted. Like, I hope you don't do this again anytime soon because it's just such a cool spot. And I completely forgot he did it the very next show. But what do you think about it, all this, Matt?
Well, as far as that goes, I see what you're saying. I think, it's still more impressive off Claudio in the sense that Claudio's a lot taller than Roderick Strong. But I think, he got such a good reaction that he wanted to show the Midwest crowd. I don't think he makes a habit of doing that move in every match. So I honestly think it's fine, but I get what you're saying. It's funny because this match, I feel like in some ways I liked it more than you, and in some ways I liked it less than you, because the thing that I liked that I think was better than you gave it credit for is I think you sort of downplayed the effort. You said it's a B+ effort. I think they were really trying really hard here, and they did a lot of really cool moves. You mentioned a few of them. I think what took the match down a little bit for me is that for whatever reason, it didn't seem to cohere the way some of the best versions of these matches do. It just kind of felt a little bit, I don't know, disjointed, and I can't really pinpoint why. I think they were trying to put a little storyline in with Seidel, like you said, being a little more cocky than usual, and first of all, by the way, it's weird to see Seidel with Alice in Danger because every time I see him with a woman manager, I think of Daisy Hayes as the person that matches up with him. But besides that, I like the beginning because they do a lockup, Strong and Seidel do, and it's noteworthy because they immediately go to the ground and roll around, like instantly they do that. That's very unusual for a match, unless it's a big crazy brawl where they're grounding and pounding each other. So I thought that was interesting. I thought that maybe Shingo didn't quite fit into the match as well, almost like he's trying to get used to the cadence of these matches. He still did some cool stuff though. And I thought that Seidel was really game for taking Roderick Strong's chops here. There's some of the better Strong chops that I've seen in a while with Seidel. And I definitely think that Seidel was trying to show off some of his Dragon Gate training. He was doing he did one of the oddest roll-ups I've ever seen. I can't even describe it, but I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And
he trips into it.
Yeah, he hooks Aries' arm and does a roll through. It's very strange. But the downside of it is that by doing it, you roll so far to do it that you kind of there's no way to get away from the ropes. So it's that was an issue. Then there was another cool spot where Seidel hit a drop kick on Aries and gloats for a second saying, "That's what champions are made of." So so Strong just comes in and knees him in the back. I enjoyed that. At another point where we get into the verbal Matt Seidel, he yells "blood generation" before leaping up and dropping Aries' torso onto his knees, and then doing another move where he drives Aries into the mat from the same position while Shingo was holding him up in the the wheelbarrow position. But it's the late match stuff. Once we start getting into the hot moves, near falls thing, you kind of went through a bunch of the cool stuff. There was a spot where Strong suplexed Shingo, and Shingo gets right up, and Gabe yells, "Shingo is immune to suplexes." Is that a thing that I just didn't know about? That that's his gimmick, that he's immune to suplexes?
I don't think. I think the only character development they've given Shingo so far in Ring of Honor is Shingo love table.
Yes, he loves tables and he's immune to suplexes. But yeah, otherwise, I kind of put the match at the same level as you. I just kind of maybe do that for different reasons.
Yeah, you get to the same destination in a different way. That's interesting. I trailed off there because I realized I clicked something away for a second because I got some weird pop-up on my laptop, and all of a sudden I don't know if you people heard what I would call the slow panic of realizing I had to get back to my notes. After the match, Aries grabs Seidel's ROH tag title belt and poses with it before he hands it back to him. And then we get a quick little video package. Ring of Honor usually only saves this for their big matches, that building up the Bryan Danielson versus Samoa Joe main event. Perfectly fine, standard for ROH video package, clips of their past matches and overdubbed with audio clips of their past promos, which brings us to the ROH World Title Steel Cage match. Bryan Danielson successfully defends the title, defeating Samoa Joe in 20 minutes, 40 seconds when he escaped the cage. This is the big feud ender, Matt. We've seen these guys wrestle each other a lot the last few months. I believe this is the last time these two wrestle each other, period.
Yeah, ever, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and
again,
so
another match that theoretically could still happen.
Yeah, in fact, I'd be interested in – I might have something to say about that in a bit. But, Matt, what do you think about, big cage match? This is the match of the weekend, even though this is the first half of the weekend. This is kind of like the draw.
Well, as I said – for whatever reason, something was missing from the heat and the atmosphere and the intensity of this feud. Like, if you told me, like, in February of 2006, like, the year was going to end with a several match series between Samoa Joe and Bryan Danielson for the title, I'd say, oh, that sounds like some of the biggest ROH matches ever, right? Wouldn't you think that?
Yeah. I mean, I'd be like, holy shit, we're eating good.
Yeah,
as the kids might say.
And none of these matches really landed that way. The one that came the closest was their first match, the hour-long draw, which was, certainly a divisive match in terms of how much people liked it. I don't think anyone really feels strongly about their other matches. And they were all good because these two guys are some of the best ever, right? So they were all good matches. Yeah. None of them had great heat, including this one. But I would say, so this match was good in a lot of ways. Like, I thought that Joe did a good job. Like, basically, Joe was on offense for almost the entire match. Like, in fact, Gabe even mentions on commentary, it takes about 10 minutes before Danielson gets one significant offensive maneuver off. It's Joe ramming Danielson into the cage. Danielson's bleeding, which Gabe says the first time ever in ROH, which I was trying to think. It doesn't sound right, but I guess it might be. He bleeds a lot in matches after this, but maybe he never did before this. And the thing is,
I was going to ask you about that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask you about that. Like, I can't remember if he's bled before or not. Maybe legitimately bleed. I don't know. I mean, he definitely. Yeah, this was before he was corrupted by the influence of Jon Moxley to love the blade. But
but like I know that he had blood on his head in the Nigel McGuinness match at Unified, but I guess it was probably Nigel's blood. So he probably wasn't bleeding. So the gimmick is, he's getting the shit kicked out of him. He keeps trying to escape because escape the cage rules are part of the match. So at one point Joe stops Danielson by just putting him on top of one of his shoulders, in a pretty impressive display of power and just dropping backwards. He does like a mini ole ole kick with Danielson's head like against the cage, and that's when Danielson blades. And then pretty early in the match, Homicide comes down and asks, and they get the ref to open the door because one of my pet peeves about these escape the cage matches is, like, in order to do that, like, they just have to open the door, which means the door isn't locked, which kind of makes the cage kind of makes the integrity of the cage less strong. But so Homicide comes down and throws Joe the ghetto fork, and so Joe starts forking him pretty quickly. At one point, Gabe says, "Oh, a fork in the ass," and Prazak says, "You said it, Jimmy Bauer, a fork in the ass," because Gabe. Because Joe forked him in the ass. That's what happened.
That was I made a point to write that down. If there's any one reason you watch this show, is to hear like Prazak, like the way Prazak just says, "That's right, Jimmy Bauer, a fork in the ass."
Joe is actually working the fork longer than Homicide usually does. Like he sticks with the fork for a long time as his main source of offense. At one point, Todd Sinclair tries to grab the fork from him, but Joe threatens Sinclair and backs him into the cage. And then Danielson tries to climb out again. Joe meets him up on the top rope, rams him again into the cage, and then leaps off the top with like a loud kick to Danielson's side, and Danielson falls. So basically, Joe is on like one on ropes. Danielson's on like the adjacent side of the top rope. Joe leaps from one to the other and does this loud kick. And Danielson falls, and that spot gets a really big pop. Gets a holy shit chant, one of the bigger pops of the match. It actually wasn't that devastating a kick because of where he landed it, but because of like the leap and the sound that it made, it worked pretty well. And there's a spot where Joe does the STF and he just drives his nails into Danielson's cut, but Danielson's blood is drying up at this point. Finally, about 13 minutes in, Joe knocks Danielson off the top rope and tries to escape the cage, but Danielson catches him with the belly-to-back superplex. So he hits that's the first significant move, and then he hits the diving headbutt for 2. And at that point, they fight over escaping the cage. Danielson's getting a little more offense here. He hits the Regal Plex, he hits the missile drop kick and the kip up. He gets on the chicken wing. Joe powers out by flinging Danielson headfirst back into the cage. They do some more near falls. They do a spot where Danielson, his arm drops twice in the choke, and he climbs up the turnbuckles, Bret Hart style, for a cover. Gets 2, a few more roll-ups. Then Danielson avoids the corner knee, puts Joe in a tree of woe, which looked like it was pretty dangerous. Like Joe in the tree of woe, because of how heavy he is, feels like it could mess up his knee, but I guess he was fine. Although maybe not, because didn't Joe have an injury shortly after this?
Well, here's the crazy thing. This is after this weekend. There's a note I have. I forget which newsletter, but they say after this weekend, Joe had reinflamed his sciatica that he had been dealing with. So ironically, he hurts a different part of his, but he puts his back out.
Yeah, and then so Joe got the choke on Daniel. So Danielson's trying to go over the cage while Joe's in the tree of woe. Joe gets out. Danielson's hanging over the top of the cage, and Joe puts on the choke from that position. And so you could all see where this is going. Danielson passes out. He slips out of Joe's clutches and falls to the ground to keep the title, which definitely feels like a cheap ending. Like, in a vacuum, I think this was a good match. Like, the match is probably better than it gets credit for. But here's the problem with it. This is Samoa Joe against Bryan Danielson, and it feels generically worked like chicken shit heel versus dominant babyface. Danielson felt like a punching bag for like 2/3 of the match. And it's like, I think everyone, when you want Samoa Joe in 2006 versus Bryan Danielson in 2006, you want to see the two evenly matched best world champions in ROH history have an epic struggle against each other. And instead, Joe just got to dominate, and Danielson kind of got out of it on the skin of his teeth. Like, this is what I'm saying. Like, Danielson could be a heelish, but like when he's this much of a heel, I think it diminishes what worked about him even during this run. And I don't know. It's hard for me not to blame the fact that Joe is the TNA guy, and it's like, oh, we can't have Joe like, having a brutal cage match. He has to just kind of be dominant and then, lose in a non-convincing fashion. So, like, the match was smartly worked. The action was good, but it was so much less than what you would expect out of a match between these two. I think for that reason specifically.
Yeah, you did one of those great reviews where, like, some of the things you said are, like, from my notes word for word almost, but I agree on a lot. I probably have a different way of looking at some things, but I think we come basically to the exact same position. I would say, like, this is one of those things where it would be interesting for me to say this was a classic match that redeemed a somewhat disappointing feud. That'd be a great narrative to have between two all-time greats, or that it was like an ultra disappointment that like really put a cherry on top of what has been sometimes like a kind of underwhelming feud, right? But I think it's neither, unfortunately. It's a very good 3 3/4 star match, I would say, that doesn't feel like an epic climax to a feud. But I also would say it doesn't feel like just another match. Like it doesn't take full advantage of the cage, but also doesn't feel like it doesn't use it enough to justify it. Like, the way I would review this match is it feels extra, but not enough extra, which is why I kept nodding along while you were reviewing, like, the idea of, like, I think you hit on it perfectly, like the idea of, like, this is a good match, but it's just not the good you want from these two guys. It doesn't quite feel like you would want to feel. It's not as good as you'd want, which in some ways you could argue is like their entire history together, right? to different degrees.
Yeah, except for maybe that match at Midnight Express reunion.
Yeah. So, like, the first few minutes, though, I was actually kind of down this match because I thought those first few minutes were pretty basic. They lacked a lot of imagination. That's where I really noticed kind of what you were saying about, like, at the end of your review of, like, just, you know, this match didn't feel like it was these two guys. It felt just very like this could be any two guys, a heel and a face, doing a cage match. You know, it's basic strikes and Bryan trying to climb the cage a few times whenever he gets the chance, like a chicken shit heel would do. Like right at the start of the match, I'm going to try and leave immediately. But then when Bryan blades, it picked up. And it's funny, like, you can really see Bryan blade here. If you're a fan of visible blading, watch this match because there's a spot where Bryan gets caught against the cage and gets like thumped into it, but not very hard at all. It doesn't even hit his head. And you see him immediately lie on the canvas against the cage, and you see he's immediately grabbing his wrist tape to get the blade from there. And then he ends up in this great position for like a Joe, like he kind of scoots, so he's in a sitting position against the turnbuckle. So he's in a perfect position for Joe to do the running boot to the head, which you're thinking, okay, that'll be where he blades. Except as Joe's running, Bryan rolls to a stomach maybe because he's like, you know what, I got to start getting ready to blade already. So Joe's halfway to Bryan, he's mid-run, and he decides, so Joe's like, okay, I'll just stomp him on the back. And then Bryan blades and comes up bleeding from a stomp to the back. So that must have been some hell of a stomp. But it was a good blade job, and it was somewhat of a novelty because we didn't see Bryan like bleed much at all, blade at least much at all. I mean, I've seen bleed from the chest, from chops and stuff. And then the match starts picking up there when Homicide throws the ghetto fork, which I thought, you know, that's a nice nod to like Homicide telling Joe earlier, like, you better kill this guy, like the idea, and that Joe and Homicide have become kind of friends at this point. So the idea that Homicide actually kind of wants to, like, you know, even though he has a reason to hate Bryan, he kind of wants to wrestle Joe. He wants Joe to win here. Then we get the fork in the ass line. The other thing I noticed, Matt, we've seen the ghetto fork so often. This was the match, and I don't know if I've ever felt more white, Matt. I Googled ghetto fork because I was like, is ghetto fork an actual thing, or is it just Ring of Honor? What I discovered, Matt, is there's a piece of equipment for some bikes called a ghetto fork. Apart from that, it is strictly a Homicide thing.
Yes.
There's no ghetto fork in the streets. I have never felt more white. I had to know. There is not. I was like, is there a lot of ghetto forks? What's the history of the ghetto fork?
I would love to know what that would even entail.
But anyway, you know, we did get a couple, you know, what I want in a big feud ending gimmick match is I want spots we don't normally see. And we did get, you know, Bryan bleeding, which we didn't get very often. We did get the big Joe jumping off the top rope for the kick while Bryan stands on another top rope. So we did get a couple things too. And it also, if it's a big feud ending match, I'd like some callbacks. And we did get a couple nice callbacks here. They did the Danielson O'Connor roll where he does that, and then Joe flips the roll into the rear naked choke spot. And they did that at the end of the 60-minute match, which I think was not just my favorite spot of that match. That was one of my favorite spots of the year, maybe. And the crowd on that night lost their minds for that spot. Here, the crowd doesn't really. Like, it's kind of it kind of sums up this crowd where they're just kind of like, yay, but it's not that big. And then I like that part at the end that you mentioned where it's just a real simple thing where Bryan puts Joe in the tree of woe and he does the repeated elbows, but instead of the head, he does it to Joe's knee before he climbs up. And I just like, again, this whole feud's been about Joe's knee and, you know, Bryan chop blocking at the Cage of Death match and, you know, Joe trying to stress before the hour-long match, you know, I've you know, my knee's better now. I've been working out on it. I like that they brought right at the end of the feud, they bring it all back to like, I'm going to break your knee again and then I'm just going to get out of here. And then we had the ending, and I feel a lot of ways about the ending. Like, I thought it was fairly inventive, you know, with Bryan climbing the cage. Joe grabs him at the top, tries to do the muscle buster, and then, like you said, Bryan fights out of it, and he's on the outside of the cage. Joe grabs him in the choke, holds it for a bit. Bryan appears to pass out, goes limp, and falls out of Joe's grip to the floor. So it's tough because on one hand, I can make complaints about it, right? Like, I could say if Bryan really passed out, the ref, if he was really on the ball, could have caught that immediately and called the match for Joe. You could also argue that Joe would be dumb to choke Bryan as he hung outside the cage because it's like, what do you expect is going to happen, Joe? Like, if he's going to pass out, this is going to happen. He's going to be dead weight in your arms as you're like on the other side of the cage. But what I would say why I did not mind it is it all happened quickly enough and they got to that position organically enough that those arguments really didn't get to me, because I just felt like it all happened so quickly. It wasn't like Joe's plan was that. It was just like they were fighting on the top of the cage, and Bryan just happened to be on the outside of the cage, and he got put, and his back was to Joe, and Joe jumped at the chance, and it happened so quickly the ref couldn't really figure out what to do and all that. And it is smart as a finish in the sense of it protects Joe, but it kind of it's a clean win technically, and Bryan the heel kind of weasels his way out. But I completely agree with what you were saying about it doesn't feel what you would want from Ring of Honor. Like what you were talking about earlier in the night, where you were saying how, the Bryan money stuff goes against Bryan's character. I agree, but I felt what you were feeling then way more here, where I was like, the best, like, is he the best in the world and just happens to be an asshole like he's been portrayed most of the year, or is he like this Weasley guy that has to fluke out to win? And I guess you could argue Joe is such a great opponent. He's the one guy Bryan has to kind of almost get lucky against. Maybe that's a way you can have your cake and eat it too. But I do kind of agree with you in the sense of Ring of Honor is built on these big mano-a-mano feud ends. Like the Joe Punk trilogy is a great example where they just give you a definitive win, right? They go at the end of the day, as much as you might want Punk to win in that third match, Punk just isn't good enough. Like Joe figured him out. And it's just a very definitive, like you saw the better man win mano-a-mano. And here, they kind of like flinch. And maybe, like you said, maybe this is the TNA thing,
Right. That's the exact sort of ending you'd want from a Bryan Danielson Samoa Joe feud, is the way they blew off the Joe versus Punk trilogy. Just like one guy just ends up winning. And they did that with McGuinness and Danielson for most of the run too. But for whatever reason, and I can't help but blame the fact that Joe needs to be protected because he's feuding with Kurt Angle in TNA at this point, that like he can't lose definitively.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Like, because even thinking another example I just thought while you were giving other examples is like Aries, when he beat Joe and ended the title reign, the long streak, like they didn't I'll use the phrase, they didn't flinch. Like they just had Aries throw everything at Joe and beat him very definitively. Like, and that's kind of like I would say a hallmark part of Ring of Honor's identity is that they don't wuss out on big matches like that, right? Like you're going to get a definitive winner and it's going to be very clear. We're going to make the hard booking calls. We're not going to try and save face or anything like that. And that's maybe one disadvantage to guys getting big in TNA at this point, is now you kind of have to do that if you want to do the big matches. But overall, I thought there were a lot of positives in this match. I think the negatives were, I wish the match was a bit more epic for the reasons we just talked about. I could have used a couple more of the standout spots like the ones I mentioned, a couple more. And also, I just felt like the cage match didn't feel brutal in the way Joe versus Jay Briscoe at our best in the cage felt brutal. And granted, and people are going to say, oh, yeah, it's the blade job. But it's more than the blade job. Like, I felt like that match felt brutal even apart from the cage spots. And I felt like I would have loved, like, even when Joe is dominating Bryan in the first half of this match, it feels a little more like it could be any two, like Joe against anyone early. Like I wish in a feud ending match, it was just a little more brutal. Again, it goes back to my feeling about this match. It's better than average. Again, I would say almost 4 stars, but it's not better enough for the situation for the two guys. It's just not quite enough. They give you a bit more than they've recently given you. I just wish they give you a bit even more. So I want to ask about the whole feud. This is what I want to touch on earlier too, because you talked about this a lot at the start of your review. This whole feud, to me, now that we've rewatched every match, it was disappointing. But again, I want to be clear. It's disappointing by the standards of these two guys. Like literally when I did the List 'em and Learn podcast with you, where we ranked the top 10 people, I still consider these two guys, and I did then, the 2 greatest wrestlers in Ring of Honor history. And they got to wrestle each other so much. They got the 2 matches in like Joe's first year in like 2002, 2003. They had the Midnight Express reunion match. And then they had this entire feud where they had the hour-long draw, the 20-minute draw, the no anything goes match, this cage match. I think at least another match, like so many matches. And I don't know if they ever got better than like 4.25. Like, I would say their best two matches, you probably would agree, are the Midnight Express reunion and the hour-long draw. Like, those are probably the two best matches they ever had. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't think either, like, both of them I would call, like, great matches. I wouldn't call either of them, like, classics that you would expect from two guys this great in their primes, like, getting this many opportunities to go at each other.
Yeah.
And
well, I was going to say, so I think you're basically right, and I mean, I agree with you. I think a lot of people would disagree with us about that Midnight Express reunion match. I think even before we reviewed it, I would have said that it was an all-time classic. Going back to review it, I think maybe I liked it a little bit less than I remembered, but a lot of people still hold that match up pretty highly. But otherwise, I think you're totally right.
I guess the comparison I would make, and maybe this is unfair, but maybe it's not unfair comparison, because, Bryan is probably like 85, 90% of what he was physically in 2006 today, and he's got more, he's learned more, he has many more years of experience, and I would argue this last year of Bryan Danielson in 2024, 2023 is like maybe his best year ever. But I'll say this. In the last year, we saw these first-time dream matches. Like, we saw Danielson versus Will Ospreay for the first time, and Danielson versus Zack Sabre. Yes, technically, I know it happened years and years ago, but really, prime Zack Sabre Jr. We saw it for the first time in the last year, and those were both dream matches people lusted over for a long time. Where, like the Joe match, these are two of the best of their era. They're going at it, and both times, Ospreay and Zack Sabre, they knocked it out of the park very first try, and had whether you say it's 5 stars or close, like match of the year level, like this is going in their histories as one of their career highlight level matches on their first shot. Even the Danielson Okada first time, like, I would say it's kind of at the level of the top end Joe Danielson matches. And that's a match where Danielson breaks his arm and they had to follow like a crazy beloved match. And then I would say their second match at the Tokyo Dome, they hit that level that the other matches hit, where it's just like, oh my God, this is so great. And I guess what the disappointing thing about the Joe Danielson feud is they got so many tries, and they're such great wrestlers. And I know they really enjoyed working each other, to the point where, like, Joe would always talk about in like shoot interviews how much he liked working Danielson. I know Danielson in one of the AEW press conferences said he'd still like to work Joe again. And yet they got so many opportunities in these few years of their physical primes, and they never had that, like, it was always good to very good to occasionally like great, but not match of the year great. And it was like, it's just really disappointing that these two guys are so great, and there's just something about, and this is the question I'd ask you. I honestly think the way Bryan works now, I think they could have their best match ever if they worked together today. Like, I think they have it in them.
They certainly could. I think, there's other intangibles that have to be right for that moment. The crowd, I think, makes a big difference. The backdrop of like really like why they're wrestling. Like, I think if you put those two guys in just as a random TV match, they would have a great match, but I don't think it would like top their Midnight Express reunion match or anything. But if you set it up right and had the crowd raring to go, I think they definitely could. I don't even understand how anyone could argue that like these past couple of years have been Danielson's best in terms of like the quality of the matches he's put out. I just don't see an argument for it, but I mean, I guess maybe someone could try. So I think he definitely could, but I think you got to set it up the right way.
Yeah, that's been an amazing thing too, because I've had people literally on Twitter say that don't know me, but that just see tweets when I praise like how great his year is and say he's having one of the best years, if not the best year of his career. People like, I've had a couple people tweet to me, you clearly haven't seen old Ring of Honor. Like, I feel like in some ways there are that's people that have watched a lot of recent AEW and have rewatched every Ring of Honor for the first 5 years. Like, there might be, like, I don't like to be, me, I have no confidence. There may be no two people right now more qualified to make the argument about his current year being better than his peak in Ring of Honor than you and I. And
well, definitely in terms of having this stuff fresh in our minds, I would say there's no one more qualified. I'm sure different people might have different analysis abilities, that could tell me why this era was actually better. But I mean, I don't know. I'll get to my assessment of the Danielson title reign once we do Final Battle. But yeah. Danielson in AEW is on another level.
Yeah, I would agree. Like 2006 Danielson, one of his best years, but I would say like his 23 to 24 has been that good. And
I mean, his run in 2021 and early 2022 was that good also. Like, I mean, it keeps getting better, but he's, I mean, yeah, I would probably say, yeah, I mean, for sure.
But, well, I guess I will say one thing to be fair. I do think in some ways he's like the smartest he's ever been as a worker. But I will say, to be fair, like, this last year has also been helped by Tony Khan has basically like make-a-wished Bryan Danielson's life and given him like everything he could possibly want from opponents. Where like the big gift Gabe could give Bryan was like, would you like to work a semi-retired Lance Storm? Like the big gift, like, Tony Khan gave Bryan Danielson was like, hey, would you like to work Okada? Would you like to work Zack Sabre Jr.? Would you like to work Ospreay? Would you like to work Hechicero? Like Blue Demon Jr.
That's all true, but those aren't the only great matches he's had. Plus, he comes back at the last minute to replace CM Punk in a strap match against Ricky Starks and has the greatest strap match of all time. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like immediately has one of the best matches of the year in that setting. And that's not him like asking for something. That's him helping out. You know, he could do anything.
Yeah, he's had hour-long matches in AEW with Adam Page and MJF that are better than any of the hour-long matches we saw him do in 2006. Like, Absolutely. That's just an undisputable fact.
I mean, listen, I'm probably in a minority there, but I think that the MJF hour-long match was as good as any hour-long match I've seen. Like, like one of my favorite matches ever. And so I think he could do it all. And, I think in 2006, he wasn't quite the brawler that he was in terms of every other element. Now he sure as shit is. He's like the best brawler there is. Like, so he could do everything.
So the live notes that a lot of the reports came into the newsletters were pretty similar to what we felt in some ways. Like if I look up at my notes here, as I scroll up my notes, the thing I see is a fork in the ass. That's right, Jimmy Power, fork in the ass. No, the PW Torch wrote, the match was said to have been the only match that got a good reaction, as the crowd was said to have been dead for most of the night despite the in-ring action being good. I would say it got a better reaction than everything else on the show, but it still didn't get a great reaction for what you want.
And I still don't think the crowd was like notably dead compared to other shows we've watched. I will die on that hill, but yeah, I agree with you.
The Observer said based on live reports, it was a good match, not a great match. And this is where we got to the PW Insider, where they said Samoa Joe sciatica was bothering him after the double shot, an ongoing issue he's been dealing with for some time. So we then go backstage to join Davey Richards. He congrats BJ Whitmer on beating him. He says it took a knee smash into his orbital bone when he had Matt Cross locked in his Kimura lock, which no one gets out of. And then Davey Richards says a line, which it's a very minor thing. It might only tickle me, but when you were said earlier that Davey Richards was really in full meathead mode, I thought of this line again. So Davey Richards says he says, and I quote, well, not I quote, but he goes, Davey says, through all the pain in his eye right now, things have become, quote, quite clear in my brain, unquote. And the fact that he said quite clear in my brain, I was like, that is so Davey Richards. Like, not quite clear. They've become quite clear in my brain. He says something's missing, but one thing's clear. Tomorrow night, Davey Richards wins. I'll say this to Gabe. He's trying to give Davey Richards a lot of promo time, and that's how you learn. It's quite clear in my brain Davey Richards is not a great promo at this point. We then go to ringside where Bryan Danielson has regained consciousness because he's sold being completely out from that choke on the cage. He tells Bobby Cruz to announce him as the best wrestler in the world. Bobby starts to announce it as Bryan has instructed me to say, but Bryan almost attacks Bobby Cruz. Like, he gets real pissed, and he furiously demands, no, you announce as your own opinion, not mine. And Bobby Cruz, like a wuss, says, yeah, does exactly what Bryan wants. And then we return backstage where Adam Pearce is holding a leather strap. He says it wasn't long ago he took a muscle buster and a lariat, and he should have been mad at himself for losing a match for himself and Steve Corino in a tag against Joe and Homicide. But instead, at that moment, he had a moment of clarity. The people love Homicide. They want to see him win matches and bludgeon people with forks, the same people that Homicide couldn't give two shits about. And the people don't even know that. Pearce is mad that Homicide only helped Ring of Honor at Cage of Death when the gains were the greatest. He recaps the whipping Cornette gave Homicide at the end of that show. Pearce says it was the whipping Homicide deserved, and it's the whipping that and he says that Homicide one day will turn on the fans like the snake he is. Pearce says Cornette is his mentor, and now his mentor is gone because of those same fans, the sheep that follow Homicide. Pierce says that there's not one person in the locker room, in the office, or watching at home that thinks he has a chance of being Homicide in a strap match. But he says he doesn't care about winning. His goal is to continue the whipping that Cornette started as long as he can. If he's bleeding and can't even see anymore, he has nothing left to lose. His mentor is gone. The faith of the fans is gone. All he has left is 10 feet of leather strap. And that's what ends the DVD. And I thought that was a pretty darn good promo, actually, for Adam Pearce. You sometimes forget because Adam Pearce can play the comedy so much that he can be a very good promo.
I thought this was an awesome promo, and I'm going to give a spoiler alert. Adam Pearce for this promo gets my Matt F. trophy because I thought this was like the best thing on the show. Like if I had to pick one thing that like stood out as like fantastic, I thought it was this promo. Maybe you're taken down a bit by like all the stuff surrounding it, like, the Adam Pearce, the role he's been playing and all the Jim Cornette stuff. But like taken in a vacuum, this promo was fantastic. One of the best promos I've seen on an ROH DVD, period, but in a really long time. And it's weird that he's setting up a promo for a gimmick match that doesn't quite happen, right? If they change the gimmick. The other thing I noticed, though, whenever they do these close-up Adam Pearce promos, I noticed how young he was. Like, he still looked like pretty baby-faced despite being, like, a big guy. And, like, when you actually watch him in the matches, he doesn't seem that young. But he's only in his 20s still. And, like, you can really tell that when you get the close-ups of him on these DVDs.
Yeah, it's one of those magic things where bald people with facial hair sometimes, like, they look 40 when they're 20 and they look 40 when they're, like, 55. Adam Pearce does not look that much. There's a little bit of gray in his stubble, but otherwise, like, he really doesn't look much different now than he looked then. Well, yeah,
but he slimmed down a bit. And so, like, that, I guess that big kind of like what you might call baby fat, although I don't know if at 28 it's baby fat, but like in his face, like that made him look younger too. Like he really does in the close-up look younger there. But yes, if you're just looking at him most of the time, he doesn't look very different than he did back then.
So we did just now the Matt F. Trophy. So yeah, that was a really good promo. He did a really good job of like, something that sometimes people do and they don't do well. Like he brought the history into it, but it didn't just feel like he was like just reciting facts and figures like this happened then and this happened then. Like he made it kind of come alive. Like he really had a good emotional line of like, hey, this is not just what happened, but like how I feel about it. Like that you've gotten these fans to turn on me, that you don't even really care about them. You're a phony, and I'm just here to hurt you. Like it's one of those promos you really have to watch his delivery because I think, he did a really good job. Like there are some promos I can sum up in like a generic recap. I think this is the kind of promo where I wouldn't call it an all-time classic, but it's good in reading it. It's better in his delivery for sure. So that brings us to the end of the show. Matt, what did you think about the first night of the Chicago Spectacular?
Well, it's another one of those ROH shows where it's like, all right, like ROH has a pretty good baseline. There were a bunch of good matches. You heard us talk about them, but it still feels like fairly cold, and there was no great matches. And I'm sorry, but with ROH, like, you're paying for every DVD. You want great matches. Like, the first, what put ROH on the map early was that all of their shows had at least one great match that you had to see. And you're just not getting that on a lot of these recent shows. You certainly didn't get one on this night. And, it's like some promotions can get away with like, oh, you put a bunch of 3-star matches or 3.5-star matches. Like, oh, you really nailed it. Like, I remember WrestleMania 14 in 1998 got a lot of praise online because it was like, oh, every match was kind of good. Like, it was like, that was the standard for a WWF pay-per-view in 1998.
It was this whole show was just 3-star matches up and down. And that was like, this is a refreshing change.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it doesn't work for ROH, just like it wouldn't work for AEW now. If you're watching an AEW show, like, you want a great match, right? Even now. If you're watching an ROH show in 2006, you want great matches. This didn't deliver that. It was, pretty good stuff, some quiet crowd stuff, some weird booking decisions with the DQs that were unsatisfying, some storylines that haven't quite connected the way that they should have, some feuds that haven't quite connected the way they should have. So certainly not like a bad watch or anything, but like nothing that you would choose to watch necessarily if you weren't doing it because you were reviewing it for a podcast. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. This was a decent show, I would say. Like, I did not have a bad time watching it. We've seen worse shows recently than this show.
Absolutely.
But I think the difference is there was some kind of higher expectations. When you say Samoa Joe, Bryan Danielson, steel cage, end of their feud that's been going on for a long time, your expectations are raised. Even something like, oh, Jimmy Jacobs, Colt Cabana finally got to wrestle when they've been doing this feud for show after show after show. You expect more than just an excuse for an angle. And yeah, it was just a show where, it felt kind of weird. It's a show that kind of had the A show lineup for this weekend, yet it still also kind of feels like a B show in execution. And it spent a bunch of its time building stuff for like the future and for tomorrow night. Again, but it'll be interesting because, that is a show where Gabe apparently rebooked some of it on the fly because he was unsatisfied with how this show went. And, that show does have even though on paper that card does not look as enticing as this card, that show is remembered critically, I think, more fondly. So it'll be very interesting to revisit that. So for plugs, ThROH@gmail.com, THROH for through. We've gotten a few nice emails lately. At Trevor Dame on Twitter, at Mayor MGF on Twitter for Matt. And yeah, that's the show. So next time we will be covering the Chicago Spectacular Night 2, which has like an 8-man elimination tag main event, Team Danielson versus Team Delirious. Samoa Joe faces Mark Briscoe, Davey Richards and Jay Briscoe. It's like, again, the reviews are pretty good online. Like, they're better than this show. So
Homicide against Adam Pearce in not a strap match.
Yeah, so in a classic, we brought a cage for the weekend, we might as well use it both nights match. It'll be interesting. It's a match it's a show that on paper I wasn't really looking forward to, but based on like word of mouth, I'm kind of interested in seeing how it stacks up on rewatch. So that'll be fun to get to. We're almost through 2006, folks. We're counting it down. So until next time, have a good time. Have a great time.